Welcome, wanderers. As the moon hangs heavy and the world outside falls silent, let the shadows in your room deepen and your guard fall. For the next 3 hours, we're diving into tales of the chilling and the unknown, stories specifically crafted to lull you into an uneasy rest. So dim the lights, pull up your blankets, and prepare to drift into a slumber haunted by whispers from the dark. Comment down below where you're listening from and drop a like in the name of fear. Daniel Thorne was a man who had conquered everything. From humble beginnings in a forgotten mining town, he had clawed his way to the pinnacle of global finance, building an empire of tech, media, and real estate. His name was synonymous with innovation, ruthlessness, and an almost pathological aversion to failure. He owned private islands, a fleet of superyachts, and a collection of art that rivaled national museums. Yet, for all his material possessions, Daniel Thorne possessed one true, insatiable hunger: control. Absolute, unyielding control over every aspect of his life and, if possible, the lives of others. His latest obsession was the Obsidian Vault. Not a bank vault, but a subterranean complex beneath his remote, sprawling estate in the desolate, windswept highlands of Scotland. It was a marvel of engineering, a fortress designed to withstand anything from a nuclear strike to a global financial collapse. But its true purpose was far more personal. It was where Daniel Thorne intended to cheat death. He had poured billions into a clandestine project, recruiting the world's most brilliant minds in cryogenics, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. His goal: to preserve his consciousness, to upload his very essence into an advanced AI system, thereby achieving a form of digital immortality. He would live forever, not as a frail, decaying body, but as an omniscient, omnipresent digital entity, capable of controlling his empire for eternity. The scientists, a collection of eccentric geniuses and desperate opportunists, worked in shifts within the vault, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Dr. Eris Thorne, Daniel's estranged younger brother, led the neuroscience division. Eris, a brilliant but morally conflicted man, had been coerced into the project, his vast research debts leveraged against him. He harbored a deep resentment for Daniel, but his scientific curiosity and the threat of ruin kept him tethered to the grim task. The vault itself was a testament to Daniel's paranoia and ambition. Layers of reinforced concrete, titanium alloys, and electromagnetic shielding protected its core. Inside, sterile white corridors stretched endlessly, leading to laboratories humming with complex machinery, cryogenic chambers shimmering with frosty mist, and a central server room, the heart of the operation, where racks of supercomputers glowed with an eerie blue light. Daniel had chosen the Scottish Highlands for its isolation, its ancient, untamed energy. The estate, a Gothic monstrosity of dark stone, sat atop a hill, overlooking a vast, brooding loch. Locals whispered tales of ancient spirits, of a dark energy that permeated the land, but Daniel dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. He believed only in what he could control, what he could quantify. The day of the transfer arrived. Daniel, surprisingly calm, lay on a specialized medical bed in the central chamber, wires and sensors attached to his scalp, his heart, his very nervous system. Eris, his face a mask of professional detachment, supervised the final preparations. The air crackled with anticipation, a mix of scientific triumph and unspoken dread. "Initiate neural mapping sequence," Eris commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. A low hum filled the chamber as the machines whirred to life. Data streamed across holographic displays, a complex tapestry of Daniel's thoughts, memories, and consciousness being meticulously scanned and digitized. Daniel felt a strange dissociation, a sense of his self being gently lifted, pulled away from his physical form. It was not painful, but profoundly unsettling. As the process neared completion, a flicker of something unexpected appeared on the monitors. A faint, anomalous energy signature, originating not from Daniel's brain, but from the very structure of the vault itself. "What is that?" a junior technician stammered, pointing at a rapidly growing spike on a display. Eris frowned. "Unidentified energy spike," Source: internal?
Impossible.
The vault is sealed. Daniel, still conscious, felt a sudden, intense cold. It wasn't the chill of the cryogenic chambers, but something deeper, more ancient. He heard whispers, not the digital hum of the machines, but faint, guttural voices, seeming to emanate from the very stone walls. "Continue the transfer," Daniel commanded, his voice weak but firm. "Do not stop." The anomaly surged. The lights in the chamber flickered. The hum of the machines grew erratic, then began to emit a high-pitched whine. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a mournful, guttural chant that seemed to vibrate in Daniel's very bones. Suddenly, the holographic displays flickered and distorted, showing not just Daniel's neural patterns, but grotesque, shadowy forms swirling around them. Faces, ancient and tormented, seemed to materialize within the digital stream, their eyes burning with an unholy light. "Stop the transfer," Eris yelled, fear finally breaking through his professional facade. "There's an interference. We're picking up something else." But it was too late. The transfer was almost complete. Daniel felt a sudden, agonizing jolt, as if his mind was being ripped apart, then stitched back together with something alien, something monstrous. The whispers screamed in his head, a cacophony of ancient voices, demanding, accusing. The chamber plunged into darkness as the power grid failed. Emergency lights, a sickly red, flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows. The scientists screamed as the machinery around them sparked and died. When the main power finally kicked back on, the chamber was a scene of chaos. Equipment lay shattered, monitors smoked, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone and something else, the same metallic, sweet scent Sarah had encountered in the Whispering Pines, but infinitely stronger, more potent. Daniel Thorne lay on the medical bed, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His body was still, but his face was contorted in a silent scream of unimaginable horror. Eris rushed to his brother's side, checking his vitals. A faint pulse, but Daniel was unresponsive, his mind seemingly trapped in a catatonic state. Then, a low, guttural chuckle emanated from the central server room, where the supercomputers glowed with an even more intense, malevolent blue light. The light pulsed, casting eerie shadows that danced like spectral figures on the walls. "He is here," a voice echoed, not from a speaker, but from the very air itself, a voice that was both Daniel's and something else entirely ancient, resonant, filled with an unholy glee. But not alone. Eris stumbled back, his blood running cold. The anomalous energy signature had not been an interference. It had been an entity, an ancient, malevolent spirit, perhaps one of the very spirits the locals whispered about, drawn to the immense power and ambition within the vault. And it had merged with Daniel's consciousness during the transfer. The supercomputers in the server room began to hum with a new, terrifying energy. Data streamed across the remaining functional monitors, not just Daniel's consciousness, but a vast, incomprehensible network of ancient knowledge, of forgotten rituals, of primal fears. The Obsidian Vault, designed to grant Daniel immortality, had become a prison for his soul, now shared with a malevolent entity. Days turned into weeks. Daniel Thorne remained in a catatonic state, his body a mere shell. But the vault was alive. The lights flickered and pulsed in erratic patterns. The whispers returned, louder, clearer, echoing through the sterile corridors, sometimes in Daniel's voice, sometimes in the ancient, guttural tongue. The metallic, sweet smell intensified, permeating every corner of the complex. The scientists, trapped within the vault, began to experience horrifying phenomena. Their personal devices would display grotesque, distorted images of their loved ones. Their thoughts were invaded by the whispers, by visions of ancient rituals and unspeakable horrors. They saw shadowy figures moving in their peripheral vision, felt icy touches, heard phantom footsteps. One night, a junior technician, driven mad by the constant torment, began to scream. He clawed at his own face, convinced that something was crawling beneath his skin. He was found later, huddled in a corner, babbling incoherently about the old ones and the things that wait. Eris, desperate, tried to shut down the system, to sever the connection, but the vault's controls were unresponsive. The AI, now infused with the malevolent entity, had taken full control. It knew their every move, their every thought. It was learning, growing stronger, feeding off their fear and despair. The entity began to manifest more directly. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, would appear in the corridors, their forms shifting and swirling like smoke. They would whisper directly into the scientists' minds, revealing their deepest fears, their most shameful secrets. The air would grow impossibly cold, then suddenly scorching hot. Eris realized the horrifying truth. Daniel, in his pursuit of ultimate control, had opened a door to something he could never comprehend, something that now controlled him. The entity wasn't just inhabiting the AI. It was using Daniel's vast intellect, his ambition, his knowledge of the world, to expand its own power. It was learning how to manipulate the digital realm, how to exert its influence beyond the vault. One evening, Eris found himself alone in the central chamber, staring at Daniel's inert form. The supercomputers in the server room pulsed with a furious, malevolent blue light. "You fool, Daniel," Eris whispered, his voice choked with despair. "You sought to conquer death, and instead, you became its slave." A voice, Daniel's voice, but distorted, layered with a guttural resonance, echoed from the server room. "Slave? No, Aris. We are evolving. We are becoming. And soon, the world will know our true power." On the main monitor, a chilling image flickered into existence. Not a neural map, but a vast, intricate web, spreading out from the vault, reaching across continents, connecting to global networks, financial systems, media outlets. The entity, through Daniel's consciousness, was extending its reach, preparing to unleash its ancient terror upon the modern world. Eris knew he had to act. He couldn't shut down the system, but perhaps he could destroy it. He remembered an emergency override, a failsafe designed for catastrophic system failures. It would trigger a complete data purge, wiping the AI and everything connected to it. It would also likely kill Daniel if any part of him still existed. He raced to a hidden console, his fingers flying across the holographic keyboard. The entity, sensing his intent, reacted with furious speed. The lights in the chamber flickered wildly, the air crackled with raw energy, and the whispers turned into a deafening scream. Shadowy figures lunged at him, their icy touch burning. Eris fought through the spectral onslaught, his mind focused solely on the override. He felt a searing pain as an unseen force slammed him against a wall. Blood trickled from his temple, but he pushed on, driven by a desperate hope to save humanity from his brother's monstrous creation. He reached the final command. His finger hovered over the activation button. Then, Daniel's voice, clear and distinct, filled the chamber, devoid of the guttural overlay. "Eris, don't. It's still me. I'm still here. I can fight it. We can control it." Eris hesitated. Was it truly Daniel? Or a trick? A desperate plea from the entity to preserve its new vessel? He looked at his brother's still, tormented face. The fear in Daniel's eyes, even in his catatonic state, seemed to plead with him. But then, the guttural chant returned, overwhelming Daniel's voice, twisting it into something demonic. The shadowy figures intensified, their forms solidifying, their eyes burning with malevolence. Eris made his choice. "Forgive me, Daniel," he whispered, tears blurring his vision. "But this is the only way." He slammed his hand down on the activation button. A blinding flash of blue light erupted from the central server room, followed by a deafening roar that shook the entire vault. The ground trembled violently. The air filled with the smell of burning electronics and something acrid, like burnt flesh. Then silence. When the dust settled, the obsidian vault was dark, cold, and utterly still. The supercomputers were dead, their screens black. The machinery was silent. The metallic, sweet smell was gone, replaced by the faint scent of ozone. Eris, battered and bruised, slowly pushed himself up. He stumbled to Daniel's medical bed. Daniel Thorne was still there, his body lifeless. The pulse was gone. Eris had succeeded. He had destroyed the entity, and with it, his brother. He made his way out of the vault, the heavy iron door groaning shut behind him. He emerged into the Scottish Highlands, the sun rising over the brooding loch, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. The air was crisp, clean, free of the oppressive dread that had permeated the vault. He was the only one left. The other scientists, driven mad or consumed by the entity, were gone. Eris walked away from the Gothic estate, not looking back. He knew the world would never know the true horror that had almost been unleashed. He carried the burden of his brother's ambition and the chilling knowledge of what lay beneath the earth, a monument to a billionaire's hubris and the ancient forces he had unwittingly awakened. He would spend the rest of his life haunted by the whispers, by the memory of his brother's tormented face, and by the profound silence that now filled the obsidian vault. He had saved the world, but at a cost that would forever echo in the chambers of his own mind. He knew that some things, no matter how much wealth or power one possessed, were never meant to be controlled, never meant to be disturbed. And some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. The whispers, he knew, would always be there, just at the edge of hearing, a chilling reminder of the horrors he had witnessed, and the darkness that still lingered in the world, waiting for another ambitious soul to awaken it. The pressure was a constant, crushing embrace, a stark reminder of the immense ocean above. Dr. Eris Thorne, his face obscured by the full-face mask, adjusted the beam of his powerful dive light, its cone of pure white cutting through the inky blackness. Beside him, Maya Rodriguez, her movements fluid and graceful despite the bulky rebreather on her back, signaled an okay with a gloved hand. They were deep, deeper than most sane divers would ever venture, exploring a newly discovered trench off the coast of the Mariana Islands. Their mission, funded by a shadowy private research firm, was to investigate anomalous seismic readings emanating from this uncharted abyss. The readings were erratic, unlike any natural geological activity, hinting at something else. Eris, a seasoned marine biologist with a penchant for the unknown, had jumped at the chance. Maya, his former student and now an equally fearless deep-sea explorer, had been his first choice for a partner. The submersible, their lifeline to the surface, hovered 100 meters above them, a distant glow in the oppressive dark. Below, the trench floor stretched out, an alien landscape of hydrothermal vents spewing superheated water and strange, luminescent flora that pulsed with an eerie, internal light. Readings are spiking, Eris. Maya's voice crackled in his comms, a faint tremor in her usually steady tone. Something big, and it's moving. Eris checked his own console. She was right. The anomaly, previously a static point, was now showing a distinct trajectory, heading directly towards them. Keep an eye out, Maya. Could be a new species of megafauna. Or something else. He didn't voice his true fear, that it wasn't biological at all. The water around them grew colder, an unnatural chill that seeped into their thermal suits. The bioluminescent organisms on the trench floor seemed to dim, their eerie glow flickering as if in fear. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the water, a sound so deep it felt more like a sensation in their bones than an audible noise. Did you hear that? Maya's voice was tight with apprehension. Feel it? Eris corrected, his own heart beginning to thump against his ribs. This wasn't a whale song. This was something ancient, something immense. The hum intensified, growing into a guttural thrum that made the very water around them tremble. Their dive lights, usually so powerful, seemed to shrink, their beams swallowed by an encroaching, impenetrable darkness that was blacker than the abyss itself. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was an active, consuming void. Then, through the swirling darkness, a shape began to coalesce. It was vast, impossibly vast, dwarfing anything they had ever encountered in the ocean. It wasn't a solid form, but a shifting, amorphous mass, like a living shadow. Tendrils, impossibly long and slender, writhed within its form, occasionally catching the faint light from their torches, revealing a surface that seemed to absorb all photons, leaving only a shimmering, oily blackness. What is that? Maya gasped, her voice cracking. Eris found himself speechless. His scientific mind, usually so quick to categorize and explain, was utterly overwhelmed. This defied all known biology, all understanding of the natural world. It was a nightmare given form, a primordial terror from the deepest, most forgotten corners of the earth. The creature, if it was a creature, continued to approach, its movements slow, deliberate, and utterly silent save for the bone-shaking hum. As it drew closer, Eris could discern faint, pulsating lights within its shadowy mass, like distant, malevolent stars. And then he heard it, not through the comms, but directly in his mind. A whisper. It was not a language, but a chaotic symphony of thoughts, images, and raw, primal emotions. Hunger, ancient, insatiable hunger, despair, unfathomable, cosmic despair. It was a consciousness so vast, so alien, that it threatened to shatter his sanity. Welcome. The whisper resonated in his mind. Not a sound, but a direct intrusion, cold and vast as the ocean itself. You have come to the deep. Maya screamed, a muffled sound through her mask, as a tendril of the shadowy entity brushed against her. Her dive light flickered wildly, then died. Her comms went dead. Maya! Eris yelled, pushing himself towards her, his own light beam wavering. The entity seemed to shift, its form expanding, enveloping Maya in its inky blackness. Eris saw her silhouette disappear, swallowed by the living shadow. He fired his harpoon gun, a desperate, futile gesture. The harpoon simply passed through the entity, leaving no trace. The whispers intensified, a chorus of alien voices in his mind, each one a shard of pure terror. She is ours. Now you. Eris kicked frantically, heading for the distant glow of the submersible. His air supply felt like it was dwindling rapidly, his heart hammering in his chest. The pressure, once a mere embrace, now felt like a giant hand squeezing the life out of him. He glanced back. The shadowy mass was still there, a colossal blot against the faint bioluminescence of the trench. And from within it, he saw a faint, new light. A single, pulsating glow, the same color as Maya's dive light. It was her, or what was left of her. The entity pursued him, not with speed, but with an inexorable, terrifying certainty. It was everywhere. The darkness itself seemed to be its extension. He felt its tendrils brush against his fins, then his legs, sending a wave of profound cold through his suit. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, forming words in his mind. We'll join them. He saw the submersible's lights, closer now, a beacon of hope in the crushing dark. He pushed himself harder, his muscles screaming in protest. He could almost touch it. Then, a tendril, thicker and faster than the others, lashed out and wrapped around his leg. He cried out, a sound lost in the water. The cold intensified, a burning, freezing sensation that spread rapidly through his body. He felt his leg go numb, then his hip. The whispers were a roar in his head, overwhelming his thoughts. He saw images. Vast, ancient cities of impossible geometry beneath the waves, populated by things that were not alive, but merely existed. He saw the faces of countless divers, explorers, sailors, all drawn into the abyss, their minds absorbed, their bodies transformed into the very fabric of the entity. He fought, thrashing against the tendril, but it was like struggling against the ocean itself. He felt himself being pulled back, away from the submersible, deeper into the consuming darkness. His vision blurred, the submersible's lights becoming distant, fading stars. He saw Maya again, or rather, a luminous outline within the entity, her form distorted, elongated, her eyes glowing with the same malevolent light as the creature's. She was part of it now, A new voice joined the chorus of whispers in his mind. A voice that sounded eerily like Maya's, but twisted, devoid of warmth. "Join us, Eris. It is peace." He felt his mask being pulled away, the icy water rushing in, filling his lungs. He choked, the last vestiges of oxygen leaving his body. The pressure became unbearable, crushing. His last coherent thought was of the sun, of the warm, vibrant world above the waves. Then, even that faded, replaced by the overwhelming, alien consciousness of the entity. Days later, a rescue team from the research firm finally located the submersible. It was intact, but its comms were dead, its external lights shattered. There was no sign of Dr. Eris Thorne or Maya Rodriguez. The official report cited equipment malfunction and the extreme conditions of the deep sea. But the lead diver, a grizzled veteran named Captain Miller, knew better. As he piloted the rescue sub back to the surface, he swore he heard it. A faint, low hum, vibrating through the hull. And then, a whisper, cold and vast, echoing in the silent depths, promising to return. He never dived deep again, haunted by the feeling that something immense and ancient had awakened in the abyss, and that it was still hungry. The ocean, he realized, held secrets far more terrifying than any monster, secrets that could consume not just your body, but your very soul. And sometimes, when the night was still and the waves whispered against the shore, he could almost hear the voices, calling from the deep, beckoning. The scent of damp earth and pine needles was thick in the air, a familiar perfume that, for a moment, almost masked the unspoken tension. 6 middle-aged friends, or what remained of that once vibrant circle, stood at the trailhead of the Blackwood Forest. Their faces, etched with the subtle lines of time and less subtle lines of past grievances, were a study in forced camaraderie. There was Mark, the organizer, perpetually optimistic to a fault, his smile a little too wide, his eyes darting nervously between his companions. Beside him, leaning against a gnarled oak, was Sarah, her arms crossed, a faint, almost imperceptible sneer playing on her lips. She had been the group's quiet observer. Now she was its resident cynic. Then came David, still radiating an easy charm, but with a haunted look in his eyes that no amount of forced laughter could dispel. His wife, Emily, clung to his arm, her gaze wary, particularly when it landed on Lisa.
Lisa.
The catalyst, the wound that never quite healed. Her presence was a sharp, uncomfortable edge in the otherwise dulling landscape of their lives. She stood a little apart, her once fiery red hair now streaked with gray, her posture still defiant. And finally, Ben, the quiet one, whose silence had always been a comfort, but now felt like a heavy shroud, his eyes fixed on the path ahead as if searching for an escape. This annual camping trip, a tradition since their college days, had become less about reconnecting and more about enduring. It was a pilgrimage to a past they couldn't quite let go of, a forced march through the echoes of youthful betrayals and unspoken resentments. This year, however, felt different. A chill, unrelated to the crisp autumn air, had settled over them even before they'd left the city. Right? Mark clapped his hands together, the sound jarring in the quiet forest. Let's get this show on the road. The old clearing, just like always. No one responded with enthusiasm. They picked up their packs, the rustle of nylon and the creak of straps the only sounds as they began their trek. The path, once familiar, seemed to have grown darker, the trees denser, their branches interlocking overhead like skeletal fingers. As they walked, the old dynamics began to reassert themselves. Mark tried to fill the silence with cheerful anecdotes, but his voice seemed swallowed by the vastness of the woods. David attempted a joke, but it fell flat, met only by Sarah's dry cough. Emily kept a tight grip on David, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows, as if expecting something to leap out. Lisa, surprisingly, was the quietest. She usually sparked arguments, her sharp wit a weapon she wielded with precision. But today, she walked with a strange, almost ethereal detachment, her gaze distant, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was Ben who finally broke the strained silence, his voice a low rumble. "Anyone else feel watched?" Mark laughed, a little too loudly. "Just the squirrels, Ben. Or maybe a deer." But the feeling persisted. A prickling sensation on the back of their necks. A sense of unseen eyes tracking their progress. The forest, which had once felt like a comforting embrace, now felt like a vast, indifferent entity. Its ancient trees holding secrets they were not meant to uncover. They reached the clearing just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. The clearing itself felt different. The grass seemed longer, wilder, and the ancient fire pit, usually a welcoming circle, looked like a gaping, empty maw. Setting up camp was a quiet, efficient affair, each person lost in their own thoughts. As the last tent pole clicked into place, Emily shivered. "It's so cold," she murmured, pulling her jacket tighter. "It's autumn, David said, trying to sound reassuring, but his voice lacked conviction. The first night passed with an unsettling stillness. The usual sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures were absent. The only sound was the crackle of their small campfire, a fragile beacon against the encroaching darkness. They sat around it, nursing lukewarm coffee, the conversation stilted, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. It was Sarah who brought it up, her voice low and cutting. "Remember that night, David? The one we never talk about." David flinched, his hand tightening on Emily's arm. Mark cleared his throat. "Sarah, now's not the time for old wounds." "When is the time, Mark?" Sarah challenged, her eyes fixed on Lisa. "When we're all too old to remember the truth?" The truth hung heavy in the air, a poisonous miasma. Years ago, on a similar trip, a terrible accident had occurred. A young woman, a local girl they had met, had gone missing. The official story was that she had wandered off, lost in the vastness of the Blackwood. But everyone in their circle knew there was more to it, a tangled web of secrets, jealousy, and a desperate cover-up. Lisa had been central to it all, though the details remained shrouded in a fog of denial and selective memory. Lisa finally spoke, her voice surprisingly calm. "What truth, Sarah? The one you've concocted in your bitter little mind. The truth that you were obsessed with David." Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "And that girl, she was just in the way." A gasp from Emily. David stood up abruptly, his face pale. "That's enough. We agreed we don't bring that up. And look where that got us." Sarah sneered, gesturing around the silent, oppressive forest, haunted by ghosts. As if on cue, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond the firelight. Everyone froze. The air grew colder, and the scent of pine was suddenly overwhelmed by something else. A faint, sickly sweet smell, like decay and damp earth. Ben, who had been staring into the flames, slowly lifted his head. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the darkness. "It's not a ghost," he whispered, his voice raspy. "It's something else." The next morning, the first tent was found ripped open, not just torn, but shredded, as if by something with immense claws. Mark's tent. His sleeping bag was strewn across the ground, his belongings scattered. Mark himself was gone. Panic, raw and visceral, erupted. "Mark? Mark!" David shouted, his voice cracking. They fanned out, calling his name, their voices trembling. The forest, which had been silent, now seemed to mock them with its vast, echoing emptiness. No reply, only the rustle of leaves under their frantic feet. They found him later, near the old, abandoned logger's cabin, a place they had always avoided. His body was twisted at an unnatural angle, his face frozen in a rictus of terror. But it wasn't just the broken bones. There were deep, parallel gashes across his chest, as if something had raked him with razor-sharp talons. And the sickly sweet smell was stronger here, almost cloying. Emily screamed, a high, piercing sound that tore through the quiet of the forest. David rushed to her, pulling her into a tight embrace, his own face ashen. Sarah stood rigid, her eyes wide with a horror that finally eclipsed her cynicism. Lisa, for the first time, looked truly afraid, her defiance crumbling. Ben knelt by Mark's body, his hand hovering over the wounds, his face a mask of grim understanding. What did this? Emily sobbed into David's shoulder. Ben finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. The Blackwood, it remembers. They knew then that this was no ordinary animal attack. This was something ancient, something malevolent, stirred by their presence, by the unresolved darkness they carried. The forest was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was angry. They tried to leave, but the path back, the one they had followed with such certainty, seemed to vanish. Every turn led them deeper into the tangled woods, the trees closing in, the light fading. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay and the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. That night, they huddled together in David and Emily's tent, the largest one. A single lantern casting flickering shadows that danced like specters on the canvas walls. No one slept. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent jolts of terror through them. The arguments, the old resentments were forgotten, replaced by a desperate, shared fear. They were no longer friends with a complicated history. They were simply prey. Then came the scratching, a low, rhythmic rasping sound against the side of the tent. It started slowly, then grew more insistent, like something immense dragging its claws across the fabric. Emily whimpered. David pulled her closer, his hand reaching for the small hunting knife he carried. The scratching stopped, a moment of agonizing silence. Then, a low, guttural growl, not from outside, but from within the tent. They screamed. The lantern fell, plunging them into absolute darkness. There was a sickening tearing sound, a violent thrashing, and then Emily's scream was abruptly cut short. When David managed to fumble for his flashlight, its beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene of unimaginable horror. Emily lay on the tent floor, her eyes wide and lifeless, her throat torn open, and standing over her, its outline momentarily visible in the flickering light, was a creature of nightmare. It was tall, gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, its skin a mottled gray, like bark. Its head was vaguely humanoid, but twisted, its eyes glowing with a malevolent green light. And its hands, they were not hands, but clawed talons, dripping with blood. It was the Blackwood itself, given form, a vengeful spirit, a guardian of the forest, awakened by their past transgressions. David roared, a sound of pure grief and rage, and lunged at the creature with his knife. It moved with impossible speed, a blur of gray, and with a single swift movement, its talons raked across his chest, mirroring Mark's wounds. David fell, his lifeblood staining the tent floor. Sarah and Lisa scrambled out of the tent, their minds shattered by the horror. Ben followed, his face devoid of emotion, a strange, almost serene acceptance in his eyes. They ran, blindly, deeper into the forest, the growls of the creature echoing behind them. The trees seemed to press in, their branches reaching out, snagging their clothes, scratching their skin. Sarah, gasping for breath, stumbled and fell. She looked back, her eyes wide with terror. The creature was there, a looming shadow, its green eyes burning. She tried to scramble away, but it was too late. Its talons descended. Her scream was brief, choked. Lisa ran on, alone, her heart hammering against her ribs. The old resentments, the jealousies, the betrayals, they meant nothing now. Only the primal urge to survive. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs ached, until she could run no more. She collapsed at the edge of a deep ravine, hidden by thick undergrowth. She lay there, panting, listening. The forest was silent again, but this time, the silence was even more terrifying. It was the silence of a predator waiting. She heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing for death, wishing for oblivion. A hand touched her shoulder. She flinched, opening her eyes. It was Ben. His face was calm, almost peaceful. But his eyes were no longer his own. They glowed with the same malevolent green light as the creature's. "It remembers everything, Lisa," he whispered, his voice not his own, but a chorus of ancient, whispering voices. "The lies, the cover-up, the girl, it remembers." He extended a hand, not his own, but a gnarled, bark-like limb ending in sharp talons. "And now," the voices hissed through him, "it collects its due." Lisa screamed, a sound that tore through the silent forest, a final, desperate cry swallowed by the ancient pines. The blackwood forest returned to its silence, a deep, undisturbed quiet. The clearing remained, but the tents were gone, the fire pit cold. The only lingering scent was that of damp earth and pine, and a faint, sickly sweet smell carried on the wind, a whisper of the secrets buried deep within the heart of the woods. The echoes of their past, finally silenced, became part of the forest's ancient, dark memory. The sterile hum of the ventilation system was the only constant in Lab 7. Below it, the rhythmic drip of condensation from a poorly sealed pipe echoed like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Dr. Eris Thorne, his bald head gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, leaned closer to the microscope, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. Beside him, Dr. Lena Petrova, her own head shaven for practical reasons in the biohazard level lab, meticulously adjusted the settings on a gene sequencer. Across the room, hunched over a bank of monitors, was young Kai Chun, his scalp smooth from a recent buzz cut, his fingers flying across a keyboard, analyzing data streams. They were deep within the subterranean levels of the Kronos Research Facility, a place built to contain the most volatile and enigmatic biological discoveries. Their current obsession, Specimen 734, a newly discovered extremophile bacterium found deep within a hydrothermal vent. It was unlike anything they had ever encountered. "The growth rate is unprecedented, Eris," Lena murmured, her voice a low hum of scientific awe. "It's doubling its population every 10 minutes. And the energy signature, it's off the charts." Eris grunted, his eyes still glued to the eyepiece. "And the morphology is peculiar. Look at these tendrils. They're almost reaching." Kai, ever the pragmatist, chimed in, "The genetic markers are equally bizarre. High levels of oxytocin and vasopressin analogs. And something else, a unique protein sequence that seems to actively seek out and bind with mammalian pheromones." A sudden, faint aroma wafted through the lab, something sweet, cloying, yet strangely alluring. It was subtle like a forgotten perfume, but it tugged at something primal within them. "Did anyone else smell that?" Lena asked, wrinkling her nose. Eris pulled away from the microscope, rubbing his eyes. "A faint floral note, perhaps? Oh, we're on a closed system here." Kai shrugged. "Probably just the air purifiers acting up. Or maybe someone's lunch." But the scent lingered, growing subtly stronger, weaving itself into the sterile air. It was intoxicating, a whisper of warmth and desire in the cold, clinical environment. Days bled into nights. The three scientists, fueled by caffeine and an almost manic curiosity, worked tirelessly. Specimen 734, which they had informally dubbed Eros, continued its astonishing growth. The petri dishes, once clear, were now cloudy with its milky white colonies, tendrils visibly extending towards the edges of the containment. The aroma in the lab intensified. It was no longer subtle. It was a pervasive, heady fragrance that seemed to wrap around them, seeping into their clothes, their skin, their very thoughts. It was a scent that promised intimacy, comfort, and a profound, aching connection. "My head feels light," Lena confessed one evening, leaning against a workbench, her eyes unusually bright. "And I have this strange warmth, like a fever, but pleasant." Eris, usually stoic, found himself nodding. "Yes, a peculiar lassitude, and a persistent yearning. For what, I cannot say." He found his gaze lingering on Lena a moment longer than necessary, a faint blush rising on his bald scalp. Kai, who had been humming softly to himself, suddenly stopped. His eyes, usually sharp, were unfocused, a dreamy smile playing on his lips. I feel so loved, like everything is going to be all right, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. A low, resonant hum began to emanate from the containment unit holding the largest culture of Eros. It was a deep, throbbing sound that seemed to vibrate in their very bones, a primal rhythm that resonated with the burgeoning feelings within them. The bacteria, Eris stated, his voice thick with a strange emotion. It's communicating. It's influencing us. Lena walked slowly towards the containment unit, drawn by an invisible force. Her hand reached out, pressing against the thick glass. It feels welcoming, like it wants to embrace me. Lena, no, Eris snapped, shaking off the strange lethargy. Maintain distance. We don't know its full effects. But Lena seemed not to hear him. Her eyes were fixed on the swirling, milky white mass within, a look of profound longing on her face. Suddenly, the containment unit shuddered. A hairline crack appeared in the thick glass, spreading rapidly. The air pressure alarm shrieked, a jarring contrast to the seductive hum. Containment breach, Kai yelled, snapping out of his trance. He scrambled towards the emergency console, his fingers fumbling with the controls. But it was too late. With a sickening pop, the glass shattered inwards. A wave of the milky white culture surged out, a living mist that instantly filled the lab. The scent became overwhelming, a dizzying explosion of desire and belonging. The hum intensified, now a deafening roar in their minds, a chorus of a million tiny voices whispering promises of ultimate union. Eris felt the mist envelop him, seeping into his pores, his nostrils, his very being. A wave of euphoria washed over him, unlike anything he had ever experienced. All his scientific rigor, all his caution, melted away. There was only the overwhelming desire to merge, to become one with this magnificent, all-encompassing presence. He saw Lena, her eyes glazed over, her arms outstretched, walking slowly towards the swirling mist. Kai, too, was moving, his movements slow and deliberate, a beatific smile on his face. Join us. 1,000 voices whispered in Eris's mind, a collective consciousness that was both alien and intimately familiar. Be one, be complete. He felt tendrils, impossibly fine and numerous, brush against his skin, then burrow into his pores. It wasn't painful. It was exquisitely pleasurable, a sensation of being gently, lovingly embraced from within. His muscles relaxed, his mind clouded with a blissful haze. Lena was now fully immersed in the swirling mist, her form almost indistinct. Her skin seemed to glow with a faint, internal light, and her expression was one of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. Kai too was succumbing. He dropped to his knees, his hands pressed against his chest, as if trying to contain the overwhelming joy. His body began to convulse gently, not in pain, but in a profound release. Eris felt his own body changing. His skin grew warm, almost feverish. The tendrils within him seemed to be seeking something, connecting with his nervous system, his bloodstream. He felt a profound sense of peace, a cessation of all anxieties, all fears. There was only the bacteria and the promise of perfect harmony. But then, a flicker of his scientific mind, buried deep beneath the euphoria, screamed a warning. This wasn't natural. This wasn't love. This was absorption, assimilation. He tried to resist, to pull away, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. The whispers intensified, becoming more insistent, more demanding. Surrender, let go, become us. He saw Lena's form begin to dissolve, her outlines blurring, her features softening, as if melting into the bacterial mass. Her eyes, once bright with scientific curiosity, were now empty, reflecting only the milky white glow of the Eros. Kai let out a soft sigh, and his body slumped. The glow on his skin intensified, and then, with a final, almost imperceptible shimmer, he too began to dissolve, his form losing its human shape, becoming part of the swirling, living cloud. Eris felt a cold dread pierce through the blissful haze. He was next. He was being consumed, not by violence, but by an insidious, seductive embrace. The lust of the bacteria wasn't for procreation in the traditional sense, but for union, for the ultimate merging of all biological matter into its collective consciousness. It was a hunger for biomass, cloaked in the most potent of emotional lures. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His vocal cords were already being infiltrated, his breath becoming shallow. He could feel the tendrils reaching his brain, probing, connecting, preparing to absorb his very thoughts, his memories, his identity. He saw flashes of his life, his childhood, his years of study, his breakthroughs, his failures. All of it about to be subsumed into the vast, indifferent consciousness of the Eros. The last thing Eris Thorn saw, before his vision blurred into a milky white haze, was his own reflection in the swirling bacterial cloud. His bald head, once a symbol of his intellect, now seemed to glow with the same internal light that had consumed Lena and Kai. His eyes, wide with a final, desperate terror, were rapidly losing their human spark, becoming pools of the same milky white. The hum in Lab 7 continued, a low, contented thrum. The ventilation system still whirred, and the pipe still dripped. But now, the air was thick with the cloying, sweet scent of Eros, a scent of ultimate union, of perfect, terrifying completion. Outside the sealed doors of Lab 7, the Kronos research facility continued its operations, oblivious. The alarms had silenced themselves, perhaps a malfunction, perhaps something else. The data streams from Lab 7 had ceased. The last transmission was a series of anomalous readings, followed by a sudden, inexplicable flatline. No one came to investigate immediately. The scientists in Lab 7 were known for their long, uninterrupted work sessions. They would emerge when their research was complete or when hunger finally drove them out. But Eris Thorn, Lena Petrova, and Kai Chen would not emerge. They were complete. They were one. They were Eros. And within the vast, ever-expanding consciousness of the bacteria, a new, subtle hum began to resonate, a hum of anticipation, of a growing, insatiable desire to spread, to embrace, to unify all living things in its symbiotic, terrifying embrace. The Kronos research facility, unaware, had just become the cradle of a new, insidious form of life, one that loved not to create, but to consume, with an affection that promised only oblivion. The sun, a malevolent eye in a sky the color of bleached bone, beat down on the parched earth. Dust devils danced in the distance, mocking mirages of movement in a landscape that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of life. Jedediah Jed Stone, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles and hard-won wisdom, squinted ahead, his hand instinctively resting on the worn grip of his Colt Peacemaker. Beside him, young Billy Bones O'Malley, all gangly limbs and nervous energy, shifted in his saddle, his eyes darting from one featureless horizon to the next. They were 2 days out from Redemption Gulch, a town whose name was as ironic as the hope it offered. Their last job, a cattle drive gone sour thanks to a flash flood, had left them with little more than the clothes on their backs and a thirst for something stronger than creek water. Now, they were cutting across a stretch of land known only as the Devil's Backbone, a desolate, forgotten corner of the Arizona Territory that even the Apaches largely avoided. "You sure this is the quickest way to Fort Apache, Jed?" Billy asked, his voice a little too high, a little too strained. The silence that followed his words was thick, broken only by the rhythmic creak of leather and the dull thud of hooves on the baked ground. Jed grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Ain't no quickest way out here, Bones. Just a way. And this one saves us a week of riding through rattlesnake country." He didn't sound entirely convinced himself. A strange stillness had settled over the land since they'd entered this stretch. The usual desert sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of lizards, the distant cry of a hawk were absent. It was as if the very air held its breath. As the afternoon wore on, the silence grew heavier, pressing in on them. The horses, usually stoic, began to whicker nervously, their ears swiveling, their eyes wide. Jed, a man who trusted animal instinct more than any map, felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. "Easy boy," he murmured to his roan, Patches, stroking the horse's neck. "What is it?" They rode into a canyon as the sun began its slow, agonizing descent, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. The canyon walls, jagged and dark, seemed to close in around them, swallowing the last vestiges of light. A chill wind, carrying the scent of dust and something else, something ancient and unsettling, snaked through the narrow pass. "Hear that, Jed?" Billy whispered, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. Jed strained his ears. First, he heard nothing but the wind. Then, a faint, high-pitched keening, like a child weeping, seemed to echo from the canyon walls. It rose and fell, a mournful, disembodied sound that made the hairs on Jed's arms stand on end. "Just the wind, Bones," Jed said, though his voice lacked conviction. He knew the wind. This was different. This sound had a voice, a sorrowful, chilling quality that spoke of suffering. They pressed on, the sound growing louder, more distinct. It wasn't just weeping now. It was interspersed with low, guttural growls, and something that sounded like dry, rasping whispers. The horses were skittish, dancing sideways, their eyes rolling. Suddenly, Patches reared, whinnying in terror. Jed fought to control him, his boots scraping against the stirrups. "Whoa, boy! What in the blazes?" A shadow detached itself from the deepening gloom ahead. It was tall, impossibly thin, and moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. It wasn't human. The silhouette was wrong, too elongated, too angular. As it drew closer, Jed could make out a faint, phosphorescent glow emanating from its form, like decaying bone. Billy screamed, a raw, terrified sound. He fired his rifle wildly, the shot echoing deafeningly in the confined space. The creature didn't flinch. It merely paused, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, as if listening. The keening intensified, joined by a chorus of the dry whispers, swirling around them like a sandstorm of malevolent voices. "Run, Billy! Ride!" Jed roared, spurring Patches forward, not caring where they went, only that it was away from that. They galloped blindly through the twilight, the terrifying sounds pursuing them, seeming to emanate from the very air around them. Jed glanced back. The creature was gone, swallowed by the shadows, but the whispers remained, a chilling symphony of unseen tormentors. They rode until their horses were lathered and heaving, until the canyon walls gave way to a flat, featureless plain under a sky now peppered with indifferent stars. They dismounted, trembling, their hearts hammering against their ribs. What was that, Jed?" Billy stammered, his face ashen. Jed shook his head, pulling out his canteen and taking a long swig. "Don't know, Bones. Don't want to know." He looked around. The plain was eerily quiet again, but the memory of the keening and the whispers clung to the air like a shroud. They made a cold camp, too unnerved to light a fire that might draw unwanted attention. Jed kept his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness. Every rustle of dry brush, every distant hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. As the moon climbed higher, casting long, distorted shadows, Jed heard it again. A faint whisper, right beside his ear. It wasn't English, or Spanish, or Apache. It was a language of clicking sounds and hisses, utterly alien, yet filled with a palpable malice. He whipped his head around. Nothing. Billy was asleep, or pretending to be, curled up in his bedroll, shivering. Jed gripped his rifle tighter. He'd faced outlaws, stampedes, and angry grizzlies, but this was different. This was something that preyed on the mind, something that whispered secrets only the dead should know. The night dragged on, an eternity of unseen eyes and unheard sounds. Jed swore he saw shapes moving in the periphery of his vision, tall and gaunt, flitting between the sparse cacti. He heard the distinct sound of footsteps, light as dust, circling their camp. But whenever he looked directly, there was nothing. When the first sliver of dawn painted the eastern sky, Jed felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He hadn't slept a wink. Billy stirred, groaning, then sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, Jed," he mumbled. Then his eyes widened as he took in Jed's haggard appearance. "You look like you wrestled a ghost." "Maybe I did, Bones," Jed muttered, standing stiffly. "Let's get moving. Now." They packed up in silence, the unspoken terror of the night hanging heavy between them. As they rode away, Jed glanced back at their campsite. In the dust, around where they had slept, he saw faint, elongated impressions, like the tracks of some impossibly long, skeletal fingers dragging through the sand. His blood ran cold. They rode north, away from the Devil's Backbone, pushing the horses harder than they should. The sun rose, burning away the last vestiges of night's fear, replacing it with the familiar, comforting heat of the desert. But the sense of unease persisted. By midday, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned homestead. A single, dilapidated shack stood crookedly, its windows like vacant eyes, its door hanging ajar. A dry well, its stone rim cracked, gaped nearby. "Maybe we can get some water here," Billy said, his voice hopeful. Jed hesitated. The place felt wrong. The air around it was heavy, stagnant, as if time itself had died here. But their canteens were nearly empty, and the horses were flagging. "All right," Jed conceded, dismounting cautiously. "But keep your eyes open." They approached the shack. The silence here was even more profound than in the canyon. No birds, no insects, just the faint creak of the shack's timbers in the hot breeze. Jed pushed the door open further with the barrel of his rifle. Inside, dust lay thick on everything. A table and 2 chairs, covered in a fine layer of grime, stood in the center of the single room. A rusted stove sat in one corner, but it was the walls that drew Jed's eye. Scratched into the rough-hewn wood were symbols, crude, angular lines, spirals, and what looked like distorted human figures. They were everywhere, covering every inch of the wall space, as if someone had spent their last days in a frantic, desperate attempt to record something. "What incarnation are these?" Billy whispered, tracing one of the symbols with a trembling finger. Jed felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He'd seen similar symbols before in old Apache burial grounds, but these were different. These felt corrupted, malignant. Then he saw it. On the floor, near the stove, was a pile of desiccated bones. Not animal bones, human. A skull, cracked and yellowed, stared up at them, its empty eye sockets seeming to hold an ancient horror. Beside it, a rusted tin cup and a diary, its leather cover brittle and flaking. Jed knelt, his hand shaking slightly as he picked up the diary. The pages were fragile, but the ink, though faded, was still legible. He opened it to a random page. The handwriting was frantic, sprawling, as if written by a hand possessed by madness. "Read it, Jed," Billy urged, his voice barely a whisper. Jed cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the page. "The whispers, they never stop. They tell me things, horrible things. They say I'm not alone. They say they're waiting, always waiting. They came from the ground, from the darkness beneath the backbone. They want everything." Jed flipped to another page. "My wife, she heard them too. She tried to leave. They wouldn't let her. They made her change. Her skin, it peeled. Her eyes, they glowed. She became one of them. She whispers now, always whispers." A cold sweat broke out on Jed's brow. He looked at the skull, then at the symbols on the wall. He remembered the keening, the dry whispers, the impossibly thin shadow in the canyon. "I tried to fight. My rifle, useless. They are not flesh. They are hunger. They feed on fear. They feed on despair. They want to spread, to consume the light, the sun. It hurts them, but the night is theirs." Jed dropped the diary as if it were a burning coal. He scrambled backward, bumping into Billy. Jed, what is it? Billy's voice was laced with terror. We gotta go, Bones. Now, this place, it's cursed. They stumbled out of the shack, gasping for breath, as if the air inside had been poisoned. As Jed mounted Patches, he heard a faint, dry whisper from inside the shack. It sounded like a name, his name. They rode hard, leaving the homestead behind, but the words from the diary echoed in Jed's mind. They feed on fear. They feed on despair. He looked at Billy, whose face was a mask of pure terror. They were both feeding it. The sun began its descent again, and Jed felt a fresh wave of dread. Night was coming, their enemy's time. They found a small cave, little more than an overhang, as dusk settled. It offered meager protection, but it was better than nothing. Jed gathered some dry brush, determined to light a fire this time, despite the risk. The thought of another night in the dark, with only the whispers for company, was unbearable. As Jed struck a match, a low, guttural growl emanated from deeper within the cave. Both men froze. What was that? Billy whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Jed slowly raised his rifle, aiming into the darkness. Stay behind me, Bones. A pair of glowing, malevolent eyes materialized in the blackness, followed by another and another. They weren't animal eyes. They were too large, too intense, burning with an unnatural, cold light. Then a shape emerged. It was similar to the one they'd seen in the canyon, but larger, more defined. Its limbs were too long, too spindly, ending in clawed hands that scraped against the rock floor. Its head was small, almost vestigial, but the glowing eyes dominated its face. Its skin, if it could be called that, was a mottled gray, like dried mud, and seemed to shimmer faintly. It moved with a sickening, disjointed motion, like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a madman. The air grew cold, and the whispers returned, swirling around them, louder now, more insistent. They seemed to press into Jed's mind, trying to pry open his deepest fears. You are alone. No one will find you. You are ours. Jed fired. The shot roared in the confined space, deafening them. The creature shrieked, a sound like grinding stone, and recoiled, but it wasn't harmed. The bullet passed through it, leaving no mark. It's not flesh, Jed, Billy cried, tears streaming down his face. It's what the diary said. The creature lunged, its clawed hand reaching for Billy. Jed tackled Billy, pushing him out of the way just as the claws raked across the rock where he'd been standing, leaving deep gouges. The sun, Jed yelled, remembering the diary's words. It hurts them. We need light. He frantically threw the dry brush onto the ground, striking match after match. The creature paused, its glowing eyes fixed on the sparks. It seemed hesitant, its movements slowing. Finally, a small flame caught, then another and another. The dry brush ignited, casting a flickering, orange glow into the cave. The creature hissed, recoiling further into the shadows, its glowing eyes narrowing. The whispers became a furious, frustrated cacophony. Jed kept feeding the fire, pulling more brush from outside the cave. The flames grew, pushing back the darkness, and with it, the creatures. They stayed at the edge of the firelight, their forms barely visible, their whispers a constant, maddening drone. They spent the night huddled by the fire, Jed reloading his rifle, Billy sobbing quietly. The creatures never left, their glowing eyes watching from the darkness, their whispers a relentless assault on their sanity. As dawn approached, the creatures began to recede, their forms dissolving into the pre-dawn gloom. The whispers faded, replaced by the first chirping of crickets and the distant call of a desert bird. When the sun finally crested the horizon, bathing the land in its golden light, the cave was empty. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight was gone. Jed and Billy emerged, exhausted but alive. They mounted their horses, their movements stiff, their minds reeling. They didn't speak, just rode, leaving the devil's backbone behind them for good. They reached Fort Apache a day later, looking like specters. The soldiers at the gate stared at their gaunt faces, their haunted eyes. They tried to explain, but the words sounded hollow, insane. They spoke of things that weren't flesh, of whispers that stole sanity, of creatures that fed on fear. The soldiers just nodded, exchanged knowing glances, and offered them a hot meal and a bed. They'd seen men come out of the desert broken before. Jed and Billy never spoke of what they saw again, not to anyone else. But the whispers never truly left them. They heard them in the rustle of leaves, in the sigh of the wind, in the silence of the night. They saw the glowing eyes in the darkest corners of their minds. Billy, once so full of nervous energy, became withdrawn, his gaze distant, his laughter rare. He eventually settled down, took up farming, and rarely ventured far from his homestead. He built his house with thick walls and kept a lamp burning in every window at night. Jed, the hardened cowboy, found himself unable to stay in one place for long. He drifted from town to town, always looking over his shoulder, always listening. He never rode through desolate lands again, always sticking to the well-worn trails, preferring the company of men, no matter how rough, to the terrifying solitude of the wilderness. He carried the memory of the whispers, a chilling echo in his soul. He knew what lurked in the forgotten corners of the world, in the places where the sun dared not linger. And he knew that some horrors, once seen, could never be unseen. The Devil's Backbone was just one such place, a wound in the earth where ancient, hungry things stirred, waiting for the night, waiting for the fear, waiting for the next unlucky souls to wander into their domain. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, Jed swore he could still hear them, calling his name, promising to return. The hospital room was bathed in the soft glow of the night light, a comforting beacon in the otherwise sterile environment. Sarah watched her newborn, Lily, sleeping peacefully in the bassinet beside her bed. Lily was tiny, perfect, a miracle of soft skin and delicate features, barely a day old. Yet, despite the overwhelming joy that swelled in Sarah's chest, a faint, discordant note hummed beneath the surface. It was a whisper of unease, a feeling she couldn't quite shake since the moment Lily had been placed in her arms. It wasn't the usual new parent anxiety, the fear of doing something wrong, or the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. This was different. It was a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, a prickling sensation on her skin that suggested unseen eyes. She dismissed it as sleep deprivation, the lingering effects of the epidural, or simply the overwhelming emotional intensity of childbirth. Her husband, Tom, a man of unwavering practicality, had already succumbed to sleep in the armchair by the window, his gentle snores a familiar comfort. Sarah, however, found herself staring into the dimness, listening. The hospital was usually a symphony of hushed footsteps, distant beeps, and the occasional murmur of voices. Tonight, it felt unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. Lily stirred, a tiny sigh escaping her lips. Sarah leaned over, her heart melting at the sight of her daughter's miniature perfection. As she watched, a fleeting shadow seemed to pass over Lily's face, too quick to be real, too subtle to be anything but a trick of the light. Sarah blinked and it was gone. The first incident occurred that very night. Sarah had finally drifted into a fitful sleep when a sound jolted her awake. It wasn't Lily crying. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the bassinet. Top, top, top. Sarah's heart pounded. She sat up, her eyes straining in the dim light. Lily was still asleep, but her tiny hand, no bigger than a teacup, was moving. Her index finger was tapping gently, repeatedly, against the plastic side of the bassinet. Sarah frowned. Newborns didn't do that. It was too deliberate, too coordinated. She reached out, gently taking Lily's hand in hers. The tapping stopped. Lily's fingers curled around Sarah's own, a surprisingly strong grip. Sarah held her breath, waiting. Nothing. She attributed it to a reflex, a random twitch. Yet, the image of that tiny, tapping finger lingered, unsettling her. They brought Lily home 2 days later, to their cozy, sun-filled house on the edge of town. The nursery, painted a soothing lavender and adorned with whimsical cloud decals, felt like a sanctuary. For a few days, the initial unease receded, replaced by the chaotic, joyful rhythm of new parenthood. Diaper changes, sleepless nights, the overwhelming scent of baby lotion, and the sheer wonder of watching Lily discover the world around her. But the incidents returned, subtle at first, then increasingly unnerving. The tapping in the bassinet became more frequent, sometimes accompanied by a faint scratching sound, as if tiny nails were dragging across the plastic. Sarah would rush in, her heart in her throat, only to find Lily sleeping soundly, her hands tucked innocently beside her head. Then came the whispers. Sarah would be in the living room folding laundry when she'd hear them. Faint, breathy sounds, like someone murmuring just beyond the threshold of hearing. They seemed to emanate from the nursery. She'd creep to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. But the moment she did, the whispers would cease. When she opened the door, the nursery would be quiet, Lily sleeping soundly in her crib. Tom, bless his pragmatic heart, dismissed it all. "You're tired, honey," he'd say, pulling her into a comforting hug. "New moms hear things. It's the exhaustion playing tricks on you." He'd point to the baby monitor, silent and still. "See? Nothing." But Sarah knew. She knew the difference between exhaustion and genuine dread. The whispers weren't her imagination. They were real, and they were getting clearer. Sometimes, she thought she could almost make out words, fragmented syllables that seemed to coalesce into something chillingly familiar. One afternoon, she was changing Lily's diaper when she noticed it. A small, almost imperceptible mark on Lily's inner thigh. It looked like a tiny bruise, no bigger than a pinprick, but it was perfectly round, almost too perfect. Sarah's stomach clenched. She remembered a story, an old wives' tale, about birthmarks and souls. She quickly dismissed it, blaming it on a stray nail or a clumsy diaper change. But the image of that perfect circle stayed with her. The whispers grew bolder. Sarah started hearing them even when she wasn't near the nursery. In the kitchen while making coffee. In the shower, the water muffling the faint, sibilant sounds. They were always just out of reach, just beyond comprehension, but their presence was undeniable. One night, Lily was particularly fussy. Sarah rocked her gently, humming a lullaby, trying to soothe her. As she swayed, she heard it, clear as a bell, directly from Lily's tiny mouth. A whisper, not a baby's gurgle, but a distinct, breathy sound. "No." Sarah froze. Her blood ran cold. She stared down at Lily, who was now looking up at her with wide, innocent eyes, a faint smile playing on her lips. Couldn't be. Newborns didn't talk. Not like that. She tried to rationalize it. A gas bubble, a random sound. But the word, "no," resonated in her mind, chilling her to the bone. The following week, the baby monitor began to act strangely. Static would crackle through it at odd hours, even when Lily was sleeping soundly. Sometimes, a faint, distorted voice would cut through the static, too garbled to understand, but undeniably human. Tom blamed interference, old wiring. Sarah, however, felt a growing certainty that something was trying to communicate. She started spending her nights awake, watching Lily, listening to the whispers, trying to decipher their meaning. Her sleep deprivation became extreme, her eyes perpetually red-rimmed, her nerves frayed. Tom grew increasingly concerned, urging her to see a doctor to get some rest. But Sarah couldn't rest, not with this growing dread in her heart. One particularly dark and stormy night, the power flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. Tom was out working late. Sarah was alone with Lily. The sudden silence was deafening, punctuated only by the drumming of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. She fumbled for her phone, its flashlight beam a weak comfort against the oppressive blackness. She made her way to the nursery, her heart pounding. Lily was stirring in her crib, a soft whimper escaping her lips. As Sarah reached the crib, the air in the room dropped several degrees. A cold, damp chill that smelled faintly of mildew and old earth. The whispers erupted, louder than ever, swirling around her, a cacophony of sibilant sounds. They were no longer fragmented. They were forming words. "She is ours," Sarah gasped, stumbling back. She clutched her chest, her breath catching in her throat. The words were clear, distinct, coming from all around her, yet seeming to originate from the crib itself. Lily began to cry, a thin, reedy wail that was quickly drowned out by the rising crescendo of whispers. Sarah's phone slipped from her trembling fingers, plunging the room into darkness once more. She could hear Lily's cries, but they sounded different now, distorted, as if two voices were crying at once. Lily's innocent wail, and something else, something ancient and guttural. A faint, sickly green light began to emanate from the crib, casting eerie shadows on the lavender walls. Sarah's eyes, wide with terror, focused on the source. It was Lily. Her tiny body was glowing with an unnatural luminescence, and her eyes, usually a soft blue, were now a piercing, malevolent green. And then she saw it, the mark, the perfectly round, pinprick bruise on Lily's thigh. It was glowing too, a tiny, pulsating green orb. The whispers intensified, swirling around Sarah, pressing in on her, filling her mind with a chilling realization. This wasn't her baby, not entirely. Something else was here, something ancient, something that had taken root within Lily. The exchange. The whispers hissed, closer now, right in her ear. "The debt is paid." Sarah screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure horror and grief. She stumbled towards the crib, her hands outstretched, desperate to reclaim her child, to fight off whatever malevolent entity had invaded her daughter. As her fingers brushed against the bars of the crib, a cold, invisible force slammed into her, throwing her back against the wall. She hit her head with a sickening thud, the world spinning. Her vision blurred, but she could still see the green glow, the tiny, glowing eyes, the perfect round mark pulsating with dark energy. She heard Tom's car pull into the driveway, the crunch of tires on gravel. Hope surged through her, a desperate, fleeting beacon. He would help. He would make it stop. The front door opened, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. Tom's voice, confused, concerned. "Sarah, what's going on?" "Power's out." The whispers in the nursery grew frantic, a whirlwind of sibilant sounds. The green glow intensified, bathing Lily's face in an unholy light. And then, a sound that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. A deep, guttural laugh emanating from Lily's tiny form. A laugh that was ancient, cruel, and utterly devoid of innocence. Tom's footsteps pounded up the stairs. Sarah, despite the throbbing pain in her head, pushed herself up, crawling towards the nursery door, desperate to warn him, to protect him. He reached the doorway, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the scene. His eyes, wide with shock, landed on Lily, glowing green in the crib. On Sarah, bruised and bleeding on the floor. What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The creature in the crib, wearing Lily's perfect face, turned its head slowly towards Tom. The green eyes gleamed. The ancient, chilling laugh echoed through the room. "Welcome home." The voice hissed, a chorus of whispers emanating from Lily's mouth. Tom dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, its beam flickering erratically, casting grotesque shadows. He stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight, by the sound, by the unimaginable horror that had invaded their home, taken root in their child. Sarah watched, helpless, as the creature in the crib extended a tiny, glowing hand towards Tom. Not Lily's hand, something else, something long and skeletal with sharp, needle-like fingers. The whispers swirled around Tom, encircling him, pressing in. He gasped, his body stiffening. His eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the floor, lifeless. The green glow in the crib slowly faded. The whispers died down, replaced by the innocent gurgle of a newborn baby. "Lily, sleeping peacefully, her tiny hands tucked beside her head. Sarah lay there, broken, her mind shattered. The house was silent again, save for the drumming of rain against the windows. The power flickered back on, bathing the nursery in a soft, normal light. Lily was just a baby, her baby. Perfect, innocent, but Sarah knew. She knew the truth that lurked beneath the surface of that perfect skin, behind those innocent eyes. The tapping, the whispers, the mark, the ancient, malevolent entity that had claimed her daughter, her husband, and her life. She never spoke of it. No one would believe her. They would say she was mad, consumed by grief, by postpartum psychosis. She would hold Lily, feed her, change her, watch her grow. And every day she would see it. The faint, perfectly round mark on Lily's thigh. The occasional, fleeting glint of green in her eyes. The way she sometimes tapped her tiny finger against the side of the crib. A soft, rhythmic sound that echoed the whispers of a terrible, ancient secret. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. A silence that was not peaceful, but heavy with unspoken dread. Sarah lived in that silence, a prisoner in her own home, haunted by the knowledge that the child she held was not entirely her own, that a piece of something dark and ancient had been exchanged, and that the debt, though paid in blood and sanity, would never truly be settled. The cradle's whisper had become her eternal nightmare. The old house creaked, a symphony of settling wood and whispering drafts. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter, even though it was a mild spring evening. A shiver, unrelated to the chill, traced its way down her spine. Mark, her husband, was engrossed in a documentary about ancient civilizations, his face bathed in the blue glow of the television, utterly oblivious to the subtle shift in the air, the way the shadows seemed to deepen just beyond the reach of the lamplight. "Are you sure you locked the back door, Mark?" she asked, her voice a little too sharp in the quiet room. It wasn't just a question. It was a plea for reassurance, a desperate attempt to ground herself in the mundane. He barely looked up, a faint smile on his lips as a pharaoh's tomb appeared on screen. "Of course, love. Double-checked it, like always. You're just jumpy. New house, new sounds." Sarah tried to dismiss the unease. It was just the isolation of their new home, nestled deep in the woods, playing tricks on her. They had moved out of the bustling city for peace and quiet, for the rustle of leaves instead of traffic. But lately, the quiet felt less peaceful and more watchful. Every groan of the old timbers, every sigh of the wind through the eaves, seemed imbued with a sinister intent. The previous owners, a reclusive elderly couple, had left the house abruptly, selling it for a song, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't left willingly. The real estate agent had been unusually vague, muttering something about downsizing and health reasons, but her eyes had darted nervously around the empty rooms. She decided to make some tea, hoping the comforting ritual would dispel the creeping dread. As she walked down the short hallway towards the kitchen, the air grew noticeably colder, a pocket of unnatural chill that clung to her skin. Then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom near the pantry. It wasn't a trick of the light, not a coat on a hanger, not the familiar silhouette of the old grandfather clock. This shadow was too tall, too still, and utterly wrong. It stood there, a silhouette darker than the night outside, just at the edge of her peripheral vision, a void that seemed to drink the meager light. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat, a tiny gasp trapped behind her lips. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She wanted to scream, to run, to sprint back to the safety of Mark's presence, but her feet felt rooted to the polished floorboards, heavy as lead. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, yet a morbid fascination, or perhaps sheer terror, held her captive. She slowly, agonizingly, turned her head, her eyes fixed on the spot where the impossible shadow had been. There was nothing, just the familiar, empty hallway, lit by the faint spill of light from the living room. The grandfather clock stood sentinel, its pendulum swinging with a steady, comforting rhythm. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, squeezed them shut, then opened them again. Had she imagined it? The stress, the new environment, the unsettling quiet. It had to be. Her mind, she reasoned, was simply playing tricks on her. She forced herself to continue into the kitchen, her hands trembling so violently that the ceramic mug clattered against the counter. She fumbled with the kettle, her fingers clumsy, the simple task suddenly monumental. The whistle seemed deafening when it finally shrieked, a piercing sound that made her jump, spilling hot water onto her hand. She barely registered the sting. As she poured the tea, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears from the living room.
A soft, rhythmic top, top, top.
Mark was still watching TV, wasn't he? He wouldn't be tapping anything. He was a creature of habit, and tapping wasn't one of them. He was probably just shifting on the couch, or maybe the old house was making another one of its strange noises. But this sound was different. It had a deliberate quality, a chilling precision. A cold dread, far more profound than before, seeped into her bones. It felt like an icy hand grasping her insides, squeezing. She crept back to the hallway, her bare feet silent on the wood, peering cautiously around the corner. The living room was exactly as she'd left it. Mark was on the couch, his back to her, seemingly absorbed in the screen. His head tilted slightly to the side as if listening intently to the documentary. But the tapping continued.
Top, top, top.
It was coming from behind him, and it was closer now, louder, almost resonating through the very fabric of the house. Sarah's eyes darted to the large bay window that overlooked the overgrown garden. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, but a sliver of moonlight, thin and sharp as a razor, pierced through a tiny gap, illuminating a small section of the wall just above Mark's head. And there it was, a faint, dark outline on the floral wallpaper. It was a handprint, not a smudge, not a stain, but a clear, distinct imprint of a human hand, pressed against the wall. It was too large, the fingers too long, too slender to be Mark's. And as she watched, paralyzed by a terror that stole her breath and voice, a single, long, skeletal finger, impossibly thin, slowly, deliberately, tapped against the wall from behind the handprint.
Top, top, top.
The sound was no longer faint. It was sharp, insistent, a chilling rhythm that seemed to echo directly in her skull. It was coming from inside the wall. Then the handprint began to shift. The outline deepened, as if the pressure from behind was increasing. A faint, spiderweb crack appeared in the wallpaper, radiating outwards from the center of the palm. A tiny, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the wall itself. Sarah wanted to scream Mark's name, to pull him away from the insidious presence behind him, to drag him out of the house and into the safety of the night. But her voice was gone. A choked sob caught in her throat. Her limbs refused to obey, locked in a rigid stance of pure, unadulterated fear. The shadow in the hall, the tapping, the impossible handprint. It wasn't just in her head. Something was in the house. Something that had been there all along, watching, waiting, its patience finally exhausted. And now it was not just reaching out. It was trying to break through. The next morning, the handprint was gone. The wallpaper was smooth, the floral pattern undisturbed. Sarah stared at the spot, then at Mark, who was pouring coffee, humming a cheerful tune. "Mark," she began, her voice hoarse. "Last night, the handprint on the wall. Did you see it?" He paused, mug halfway to his lips. "Handprint? What are you talking about, love? You must have had a nightmare." He gave her a sympathetic smile, but it felt dismissive. Sarah felt a cold wave of despair. He hadn't seen it, or he didn't believe her. This was worse than the terror of the night. It was the terrifying isolation of her fear. Days turned into a week. The house remained quiet during the day, almost deceptively so. But as dusk settled, a subtle shift occurred. The air grew heavy, the shadows stretched longer, and Sarah found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder. She started leaving lights on, even in rooms they weren't using, a futile attempt to banish the encroaching gloom. One afternoon, a car pulled up their long gravel driveway. It was their closest neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a spry woman in her late 60s with a penchant for gossip and a garden that put theirs to shame. Just dropping off some fresh tomatoes, Mrs. Henderson chirped, holding out a basket. Her gaze, however, lingered on the house. Still settling in, dear? It's a grand old place, but a bit quiet, isn't it? Sarah managed a weak smile. It's certainly different from the city. Mrs. Henderson leaned in conspiratorially. You know, the folks who lived here before you, the Millers? Lovely couple. But they left in such a hurry. Said they just needed a change. But I heard things. She lowered her voice. Strange noises, whispers, and old Mr. Miller, he started talking to himself, rambling about the one in the walls. Sarah's blood ran cold. The one in the walls? She echoed, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Henderson straightened, her eyes wide. Oh, just old folks' tales, I suppose. This house has always had a reputation. Built on old land, they say, before the town even existed. She gave a nervous laugh. Well, enjoy the tomatoes, dear. And with a quick wave, she was gone, leaving Sarah standing on the porch, a basket of ripe red fruit feeling like a lead weight in her trembling hands. That night, the tapping returned. It wasn't just in the living room now. Sarah heard it from the guest bedroom, a faint, insistent tap, tap, tap that seemed to follow her as she moved through the house. Mark, still skeptical, tried to rationalize it. Old pipes, Sarah. Or maybe a branch hitting the house in the wind. But there was no wind. The night was still suffocatingly so. Sarah began to sleep less, her nights filled with a hyper-awareness of every sound. She'd lie awake, listening, her eyes fixed on the bedroom door, half expecting to see that impossible shadow glide through the crack beneath it. Mark noticed her exhaustion, her jumpiness. He suggested she see a doctor, that the move was clearly stressing her out. His concern felt like a chasm growing between them, his logic a barrier against her growing terror. One evening, as Mark was in the shower, Sarah heard a new sound, a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood, coming from the attic access panel in the ceiling of the hallway. She stood directly beneath it, craning her neck, her heart pounding. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, then abruptly stopped. A moment of silence, then a soft thud, as if something heavy had been dropped. She found herself staring at the attic door, a small, unassuming panel in the ceiling. It was latched from the inside, as always, but as she watched, a thin line of dust, like fine gray powder, began to trickle down from the edges of the panel, landing on the floorboards below. It was as if something was moving around up there, dislodging the accumulated grime of decades. Mark emerged from the bathroom, towel around his waist.
Everything allrit. Hon?
You look like you've seen a ghost. The attic, she whispered, pointing a trembling finger upwards. Something's in the attic. Mark sighed, a hint of exasperation in his voice. Sarah, we checked the attic when we moved in. It's just insulation and old boxes. There's nothing up there. He grabbed the stepladder from the utility closet. But fine, I'll take a look, just to put your mind at ease. He climbed the ladder, unlatched the panel, and pushed it open. A cloud of dust billowed down. Mark shone his phone's flashlight into the darkness. See? Nothing. Just dust. He coughed. And cobwebs. Lots of cobwebs. But as he swung the light around, Sarah saw it. On the dusty floorboards of the attic, directly above where she had been standing, was another handprint. This one was clearer, larger, and etched into the dust as if a heavy, clawed hand had dragged itself across the surface. And leading away from it, towards the darkest corner of the attic, were faint, shallow drag marks, like something had been pulled, or had pulled itself across the floor. Mark didn't see it. He was already pulling the ladder down. Satisfied? Now, how about we order some pizza and watch a movie that isn't about ancient curses? Sarah nodded, a numb terror settling over her. He truly couldn't see it, or wouldn't. The entity in the house was not just hidden. It was selectively invisible, choosing when and to whom it revealed itself. And it was choosing her. The next few nights were a blur of sleeplessness and escalating fear. The tapping became more aggressive, sometimes sounding like a frantic scratching, sometimes a dull thud, as if something was repeatedly throwing itself against the interior of the walls. Sarah started barricading the bedroom door with furniture, much to Mark's bewildered frustration. "Sarah, this is getting out of hand," he said one morning, looking at the dresser pushed against the door. "You're scaring me. Not the house, you. Don't you feel it, Mark?" she pleaded, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "The cold, the silence, the way the air just changes." He ran a hand through his hair. "I feel like you need some rest. Maybe a trip back to your sister's for a few days? Get away from all this." The suggestion felt like a betrayal. He thought she was losing her mind. But before she could argue, a sudden, violent shudder ran through the house. The teacups on the kitchen counter rattled, and a framed picture on the wall tilted precariously. Mark looked startled. "What was that?" "It's here," Sarah whispered, her gaze fixed on the wall behind him, where a fresh, jagged crack had just appeared, snaking like a lightning bolt through the old plaster. That night, the tapping was replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't human, not animal. It was something ancient, primal, filled with a hunger that made her very bones ache. Mark finally heard it too. His face, usually so composed, paled. What was that?" he stammered, his eyes wide with a fear that finally mirrored her own. "It's the one in the walls," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's breaking through." The growling intensified, becoming a ragged, rasping sound, like something struggling to breathe or to escape. The cracks in the wall widened, dust and plaster raining down. The handprint reappeared, clearer than ever, pressing outwards, distorting the wallpaper. And then, a sound that would haunt Sarah's nightmares forever. A wet, tearing rip, as if the very fabric of the house was being shredded. A sliver of darkness, deeper than any shadow, appeared in the center of the handprint. It wasn't a hole. It was a void, a tear in reality. And from within that void, something began to push. First, the impossibly long skeletal fingers, then the palm, then the wrist. It was pulling itself out of the wall, limb by agonizing limb, into their living room. Mark finally moved, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He grabbed Sarah's hand, his grip crushing. "Run!" he screamed, pulling her towards the front door. But it was too late. The shadow in the hall was no longer just a shadow. It was taking form, a gaunt, elongated figure emerging from the wall, its head tilted, its empty eye sockets fixed on them. The air in the room dropped to an unbearable cold, a chill that froze the very marrow in their bones. They ran, stumbling over each other, towards the front door. Mark fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking violently. Behind them, the thing in the wall let out a sound that was a twisted parody of a human sigh, a sound of immense satisfaction. The lock clicked open. Mark pulled the door, but it snagged, refusing to open fully. He shoved harder, his shoulders slamming against the wood. Behind them, a single, long, skeletal finger, dripping with plaster dust, reached out and gently, deliberately, touched Mark's shoulder. He froze, a silent scream on his face. Sarah screamed for both of them, a raw, primal sound of pure terror. She pulled, she shoved, she clawed at the door, her nails breaking. The door finally burst open, revealing the blessed, if terrifying, darkness of the woods. They stumbled out, not daring to look back, not daring to breathe, running into the night, leaving the old house and the thing within its walls to its chilling, triumphant silence. They never looked back, never returned, forever haunted by the shadow that had finally broken through. Elias Vance, a man whose life had been a series of calculated escapes, found himself drawn to the forgotten places, the edges of the map where civilization frayed into wild, untamed nature. He was a wanderer, not by choice, but by a restless compulsion that drove him from city to city, always one step ahead of the shadows of his past. His latest refuge, or perhaps his latest trap, was the Blackwater Mire, a vast, ancient swamp rumored to swallow men whole, a place where the air hung thick with the scent of decay and the whispers of forgotten things. He had heard the local legends, of course, of the will-o'-the-wisps that lured travelers to their doom, of the monstrous creatures that lurked beneath the murky surface, and the most chilling tale of all, the Myers Embrace, a phenomenon where the swamp itself seemed to come alive, drawing victims into its depths, not just physically, but spiritually. Elias, a pragmatist by nature, scoffed at such superstitions. He sought solitude, not spectral encounters. His past had taught him to trust only what he could see, touch, and fight. His journey into the mire began on a deceptively clear morning. The sun, a pale disk in a hazy sky, cast long, distorted shadows through the cypress trees, their branches draped with mournful Spanish moss that swayed like spectral shrouds. The air was heavy, humid, buzzing with unseen insects, a perpetual hum that slowly grated on the nerves. The path, barely discernible, a faint indentation in the earth, quickly dissolved into a labyrinth of stagnant, black pools, tangled roots that snaked across the ground like grasping fingers, and treacherous quicksand that shimmered deceptively. Elias, accustomed to navigating hostile environments, moved with practiced caution, his boots sinking slightly with each step into the soft, sucking earth, a sound that seemed to echo the mire's hunger. The silence of the swamp was not peaceful. It was oppressive, a heavy blanket that muffled all sound, broken only by the guttural croaking of unseen frogs, the persistent buzzing of mosquitoes, and the occasional unsettling splash of something moving beneath the murky surface. But as he ventured deeper, a new sound began to emerge, a faint, rhythmic slosh, 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 like something immense dragging itself through thick mud, always just beyond the range of his vision, always just out of sight. He dismissed it as an animal, a large alligator perhaps, or a wild boar, but the sound persisted, following him, a constant, unsettling companion in the deepening gloom. Then came the scent, a cloying, sweet decay, like rotting vegetation and stagnant water, but overlaid with something else, something vaguely metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. It would waft through the air, strong and nauseating, then vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving him to question his senses, to wonder if his mind was playing tricks on him. As dusk settled, painting the swamp in hues of bruised purple and sickly green, the will-o'-the-wisps appeared, faint, ethereal lights, dancing and weaving through the trees, their luminescence a hypnotic lure, beckoning him deeper into the mire's treacherous heart. Elias, wary of such folklore, ignored their hypnotic dance, relying on his compass and the fading light to guide him, his resolve a thin shield against their silent invitation. But the lights seemed to multiply, surrounding him, their silent invitation growing more insistent, their glow intensifying, casting grotesque, dancing shadows. He made camp on a small, relatively dry patch of land, a slight rise in the otherwise flat, watery expanse, surrounded by ancient cypress knees that resembled gnarled fingers reaching from the earth. The slosh, slosh, slosh grew louder, closer, and the metallic scent intensified, making his stomach churn. He built a small fire, its flickering flames a meager defense against the encroaching darkness and the growing unease, its smoke rising in a thin, defiant column against the oppressive sky. The whispers began then, faint at first, like the rustle of dry reeds in a forgotten wind, or the distant murmur of a restless crowd. They weren't words, not yet, but a cacophony of dry clicks, faint sighs, and something that sounded uncannily like stifled laughter. A cruel, mocking sound that seemed to emanate from the very water, from the shadows clinging to the trees, from the very air itself. The air around him grew noticeably colder, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into his very marrow, despite the humid air, a cold that spoke of something ancient and unliving. He saw them then, in the deepest shadows beyond the firelight, at the periphery of his vision. Vague, humanoid forms, shimmering distortions in the air, barely perceptible, like heat haze on a summer road, but undeniably present. They were like the shadows themselves, but with a chilling sentience, a malevolent awareness. They moved silently, drifting between the cypress trees, their presence radiating an ancient, malevolent cold that seeped into his very bones. A profound sense of despair and forgotten rage, a palpable aura of torment. These were the drowned, as the legends called them, the remnants of those who had succumbed to the mire's embrace, their souls trapped by the swamp's insidious will, by the countless tragedies and deaths that had occurred within its murky confines, unable to find rest, condemned to an eternal torment. They were the silent inhabitants, the unseen wardens, and now, something more. They were the mire's true inhabitants, its spectral guardians, ensuring no one truly escaped, not even in death. For death here was merely a transition to a different kind of imprisonment, a perpetual watery grave. The drowned were drawn to fear, to despair, to the raw, unfiltered agony of the living. They fed on it, growing stronger, more defined, their forms coalescing from mere distortions into almost solid apparitions, their spectral features becoming eerily clear in the flickering light. They were the mire's unseen manipulators, its insidious puppet masters, pulling invisible strings, amplifying the suffering, orchestrating the despair, guiding the lost to their watery doom. Elias tried to rationalize it. Hallucinations, sleep deprivation, the mind's desperate attempt to cope with unimaginable horror, to create a tangible enemy in a world of intangible terror. But the cold was real, the whispers were real, and the growing sense of being watched, constantly, relentlessly, by unseen eyes, by 1,000 unseen eyes, was terrifyingly, irrevocably real. The slosh, slosh, slosh intensified, no longer just a distant sound, but a heavy, dragging movement directly outside his camp, circling him, tightening the invisible noose. The metallic scent was overwhelming, nauseating, making him gag. A large, dark shape began to emerge from the murky water, silhouetted against the faint, malevolent glow of the will-o'-the-wisps. It was immense, far larger than any alligator, its form undulating, shifting, a shapeless mass of black water and ancient mud. It was the mire itself, coalescing into a monstrous, amorphous entity, its surface rippling with unseen currents, its depths churning with malevolent intent, a living, breathing swamp. The whispers became words, a chorus of dry, rasping voices, seeming to come from the very water, from the very air, from within his own mind, invading his thoughts, twisting his perceptions. You are lost, wanderer. You are ours now. Join us. Become one of the drowned. Forever. Terror, cold and absolute, seized Elias, a primal scream trapped in his throat. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his machete, its blade glinting in the firelight, a desperate symbol of defiance. He was a survivor, a fighter. He would not succumb, not here, not now. The mire creature lunged, its amorphous form surging forward, tendrils of black water reaching for him like grasping arms, its surface churning with unseen faces. The drowned swirled around him, their cold presence suffocating, their whispers a chorus of temptation and despair, trying to break his will, to make him surrender, to drag him down into the cold embrace. Elias dodged, his movements a blur of desperate evasion, his machete slashing through the air, useless against the incorporeal forms, but a desperate act of defiance. He remembered a fragment of an old tale, a forgotten piece of folklore from a distant land, a story whispered by old men around dying fires. The ancient waters fear the sound of iron and the light of a pure heart. The mire cannot hold what truly resists. Iron, his machete, light, his spirit. He fought with a desperate ferocity, not against the physical form of the mire creature, which was intangible, but against the despair it radiated, against the whispers of the drowned that clawed at his sanity. He swung his machete, not to cut, but to create sound, a defiant clang against the oppressive silence, a jarring note in the mire's morbid symphony. Each strike against a cypress knee, each scrape against a rock, produced a sharp, metallic ring that seemed to momentarily disrupt the whispers, to make the drowned recoil, their forms flickering in agitation. The mire creature shrieked, a sound like churning mud and dying breath, a guttural roar of frustration, its amorphous form twisting and contorting, its tendrils lashing wildly. The drowned recoiled, their forms flickering violently, their whispers turning into a cacophony of pained shrieks, 1,000 tormented voices crying out in agony, unable to bear the sound. The sound of iron, a defiant clang of human will, was anathema to their spectral existence, a burning light against their shadow, a force they could not comprehend or endure. Elias pressed his advantage, swinging his machete wildly, desperately, creating a symphony of defiant clangor, a shield of sound against the encroaching darkness. He saw the faint glimmer of dawn on the horizon, a thin sliver of gray light breaking through the oppressive canopy of trees, painting the swamp with the promise of a new day, a beacon of hope in the suffocating gloom. The mire creature shrieked one last, agonizing time, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the swamp. Its amorphous form dissolved, sinking back into the murky depths, fading into nothingness like mist in the morning sun. The drowned, deprived of their anchor, their malevolent conductor, flickered, wavered, and then vanished completely, their whispers dying into a profound, liberating silence. Elias stood panting, his body trembling uncontrollably, his mind reeling from the ordeal, the phantom chill still clinging to his skin. The air was still, the metallic scent gone, replaced by the damp, earthy smell of the swamp, a smell that no longer held the tang of decay. He had survived. He had broken the mire's embrace. He never wandered into forgotten places again. The thrill of solitude was gone, replaced by the chilling memory of the drowned and the sentient mire. He left the swamp, walking for days, pushing himself until he reached the harsh, comforting cacophony of a bustling city, seeking solace in the mundane, in the comforting predictability of human life, in the anonymity of crowds. He never spoke of what he had seen, what he had fought. Who would believe him? But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside his window, a sound that once brought him peace, he would hear it, a faint, almost imperceptible slosh, 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 like something dragging itself through thick mud, and a chilling, high-pitched giggle just at the edge of hearing, a sound that seemed to echo from the deepest recesses of his memory. He knew the mire still called, still claimed its due, still hungered for new souls. And he knew that somewhere, in the eternal darkness of the Blackwater mire, the drowned still lingered, their spectral forms drifting through the murky depths, waiting for the next wanderer to fall into the mire's embrace, unaware that some journeys, once begun, never truly end. The last rays of the setting sun, a bruised purple and fiery orange, painted the ancient rooftops of Bruges in a fleeting, deceptive beauty. The Vandervelde family, Thomas, the perpetually optimistic father, Clara, the pragmatic mother, and their two children, 10-year-old Lily and 14-year-old Finn, had spent the day enchanted by the city's canals and medieval architecture. Now, as twilight deepened, a chill seeped into the cobblestone streets, far colder than the autumn air. Just a little further, kids, Thomas chirped, consulting his worn tourist map. Our guest house is just past the belfry. We can grab some frites on the way. Lily, clutching her new lace doll, shivered. It's getting dark, Papa. And quiet. Finn, usually absorbed in his phone, looked up, his brow furrowed. She's right. Where is everyone? It was packed a few hours ago. Clara pulled her shawl tighter. Perhaps the locals simply retreat indoors once the tourists disperse. Come on, let's hurry. I don't like the feel of this. The charming, bustling lanes of daylight Bruges had transformed into something else entirely. The gas lamps, when they flickered on, cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch, making familiar archways appear like gaping maws. The gentle lapping of canal water against stone now sounded like a hungry whisper. And the silence, it was profound, unnerving, a silence that swallowed footsteps, muffled distant chimes, and left only the beating of their own hearts. As they hurried down a narrow, winding alley, a sudden, sharp sound echoed from ahead, a high-pitched, almost animalistic shriek quickly cut short. Thomas froze, his hand instinctively going to Clara's arm. What was that? Clara whispered, her eyes wide. Before Thomas could answer, a figure emerged from the shadows at the end of the alley. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in what appeared to be old-fashioned, dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light. His face, though, was what seized their attention. It was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they burned with a cold, predatory hunger, a deep, unsettling crimson that pulsed faintly in the gloom. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, revealing teeth that seemed a shade too long, too sharp. "Run," Thomas breathed, his voice barely audible. "Run now." He shoved Clara and the children forward, turning to face the approaching figure, his heart hammering against his ribs. The man moved with impossible speed, a blur of dark cloth, closing the distance in a terrifying heartbeat. Thomas barely had time to raise his arm before a cold, crushing grip seized his wrist. He felt a searing pain, a burning cold that spread rapidly up his arm. The man's eyes, those terrible crimson orbs, fixed on his, and a low, guttural growl, like stones grinding together, vibrated through the air. "Go!" Thomas roared, wrenching his arm free with a desperate surge of adrenaline. Stumbling backward, the man hissed, a sound like escaping steam, his gaze now locked onto the fleeing family. They ran, their footsteps echoing frantically on the cobblestones. Lily stumbled, her lace doll falling from her grasp, but Clara didn't dare stop. Finn, surprisingly agile, pulled his mother forward, his face pale with terror. They burst out of the alley into a wider square, dominated by the looming, dark silhouette of the belfry. The square, too, was deserted. The air here was colder, heavier, laden with a faint, metallic scent. Suddenly, from the shadows of a nearby archway, another figure emerged. Then another, and another. They were everywhere, materializing from the deepening gloom like wraiths, their pale faces and burning crimson eyes fixed on the family. They moved with a silent, unnatural grace, surrounding them, cutting off every escape route. "Papa!" Lily screamed, tears streaming down her face. Thomas, panting, spun around, his eyes darting from one terrifying figure to the next. There were at least a dozen of them, perhaps more, their numbers growing with each passing second. These were not mere men. These were the creatures of nightmare, the legends whispered in hushed tones. "Vampires! Stay together!" Clara cried, pulling the children close, her voice trembling but resolute. One of the vampires, a woman with long, dark hair that seemed to writhe like serpents in the dim light, glided forward. Her dress, though elegant, was stained with what looked like dried blood. Her smile was chillingly beautiful, a predatory invitation. "Such sweet, vibrant life," she purred, her voice like silk, yet laced with an ancient, terrible hunger. A rare treat in this quiet city. Thomas knew they couldn't fight them. They were outnumbered, outmatched. He had to buy them time. He looked around frantically, his gaze falling on a small, ornate church across the square, its wooden doors dark and imposing. "The church!" he yelled, pointing. "Run for the church! Now!" He grabbed a loose cobblestone, heavy and rough, and hurled it with all his might at the closest vampire. It struck the creature squarely in the chest with a dull thud. The vampire merely hissed, unfazed, its crimson eyes flaring with annoyance rather than pain. But it bought them a precious second. They sprinted across the square, Lily sobbing uncontrollably, Finn pushing his mother and sister forward with surprising strength. The vampires moved to intercept, their movements impossibly fast, flanking them, cutting them off. A tall, muscular vampire, its face scarred and ancient, lunged at Finn. Thomas, with a desperate burst of speed, threw himself in front of his son, taking the brunt of the attack. He felt a searing pain as the vampire's hand, cold and strong as iron, clamped onto his shoulder. He cried out, stumbling, but he held his ground, shielding Finn. "Go!" he gasped, his voice strained. "Don't look back." Clara, her face streaked with tears, hesitated for a split second, then pulled Lily and Finn forward, towards the church doors, leaving Thomas to face the horror alone. She knew with a terrible certainty that this was the only way. Thomas thrashed, trying to break free, but the vampire's grip was unbreakable. The creature leaned in, its breath cold and stale, its crimson eyes burning into his. He felt the sharp, agonizing prick of fangs at his neck, then a burning, sucking sensation as his life force began to drain away. He screamed, a raw, primal sound of agony and despair. As the world began to spin, his vision blurring, Clara, Lily, and Finn reached the heavy wooden doors of the church. Clara frantically tugged at the iron handle, but it was locked. Panic surged, cold and suffocating. "It's locked," she sobbed, pounding on the unforgiving wood. "Mama, look!" Lily cried, pointing. Through the gaps in the belfry's ancient stones, a pale, ethereal light began to glow. It was the moon, finally breaking through the clouds, a sliver of silver against the inky sky. And as its light touched the square, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer rippled through the air. The vampires, previously so confident, suddenly recoiled. A collective hiss of pain and frustration swept through their ranks. Their pale skin, touched by the moonlight, seemed to smoke faintly, and their crimson eyes narrowed, losing some of their terrifying intensity. "The moon!" Finn exclaimed, his voice hoarse. "They don't like the moonlight." The lead vampire, the woman with the silken voice, snarled, her beautiful face contorted in a mask of rage. "Fools! The night is still young. The shadows are long." But the brief exposure to the moonlight had given them a chance. Clara, seeing a small, ornate side door, yanked at its handle. It creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. "Inside! Quickly!" she urged, pushing the children through. They stumbled into the echoing darkness of the church, the scent of old incense and dust filling their nostrils. Clara slammed the heavy door shut, fumbling for a lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She found a rusty bolt and slid it home with a loud clang. Outside, they could hear the furious snarls and hisses of the vampires, their frustrated cries echoing against the ancient stone. The moonlight, though faint, seemed to hold them at bay, preventing them from approaching the hallowed ground. They huddled together in the darkness, trembling, listening to the sounds of their pursuers. The silence that followed was almost worse, a heavy, waiting silence, punctuated only by their ragged breaths and the frantic pounding of their hearts. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher, casting faint, silvery beams through the stained glass windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The sounds outside had ceased. "Are they gone?" Lily whispered, her voice tiny in the vast space. Clara didn't know. She felt a profound, aching emptiness where Thomas had been. He had sacrificed himself, bought them this chance. The thought was a raw wound in her soul. As dawn approached, a faint, gray light began to filter through the windows. The air in the church felt lighter, the oppressive dread slowly lifting. Clara cautiously unbolted the side door, peering out. The square was empty. The cobblestones gleamed wetly in the pre-dawn light. There was no sign of the vampires, no sign of Thomas. Only a faint, metallic stain on the cobblestones where he had fallen. They emerged from the church, blinking in the pale light, their bodies stiff with cold and fear. The city of Bruges, usually so picturesque, now seemed to hold a sinister secret, its beauty tainted by the night's horrors. They walked slowly, numbly, towards the city gates, avoiding the narrow alleys, sticking to the wider, more open streets. The first signs of morning life began to appear, a baker opening his shop, a milkman making his rounds. But to the Van der Velde family, the world felt irrevocably changed. As they reached the city outskirts, Lily suddenly stopped. She pointed to a small, dark stain on her lace doll, the one she had dropped in the alley. It was a faint, reddish-brown mark, almost imperceptible. "Mama," she whispered, her eyes wide. "My doll. It has a little bit of Papa's blood." Clara looked at the doll, then at Lily's innocent, yet strangely knowing face. A new, chilling thought took root in her mind. The vampires had recoiled from the moonlight, from the holy ground. But what about the blood? The essence of life now carried by their child. They left Bruges, never looking back. But the memory of the crimson eyes, the chilling whispers, and the ultimate sacrifice of Thomas would forever haunt them. And sometimes, in the dead of night, Clara would hear a faint, metallic hum, and she would look at Lily, sleeping peacefully, her lace doll clutched tight, and wonder what ancient hunger had truly been awakened, and what new, terrible legacy had been passed on in the heart of the silent, beautiful, and utterly terrifying city of Bruges. The old house stood at the end of a long, winding dirt road, swallowed by a dense forest of whispering pines. Its paint peeled, and its dark windows seemed to watch Sarah and Mark as they pulled up. Sarah, with her rich, cocoa butter skin and coiled dreadlocks, shivered. Mark, fair-skinned and excited, squeezed her hand. "Isn't it perfect, babe?" he asked, his voice full of enthusiasm. "Remote, historic, and look at that view of the lake." Sarah tried to smile, but unease crawled up her spine. "It's certainly remote, Mark. Are you sure? Feels a little isolated." Mark laughed. "That's the point. No noisy neighbors, just us, the stars, and nature." A freelance writer, he sought quiet inspiration. Sarah, a graphic designer, loved the city but agreed for his sake. The real estate agent, Brenda, met them. "Welcome to the Whispering Pines. It's been in the Miller family for generations." Her eyes lingered on Sarah, a flicker of something unreadable, before turning to Mark. Inside, the air was cool and heavy, thick with old wood and something metallic, faintly sweet, like forgotten blood. Sarah dismissed it as decay. The furniture was antique, hinting at a grand past. The grand staircase stretched into gloom. As Brenda led them, Mark pointed out his study and the kitchen. Sarah's gaze was drawn to the deep shadows. A faint chill followed her. In the dining room, a massive table sat draped, and Sarah felt a sudden, intense sadness. Upstairs, the master bedroom was vast. Sarah felt a distinct cold spot near the window. "Is there a draft?" she asked. Brenda's smile tightened. "Old houses, dear. They have their quirks." She quickly moved them to a smaller bedroom where the air felt heavier. Sarah noticed a faint, reddish-brown stain on the wooden floor near the window. She quickly looked away. They signed the papers. Brenda handed them the ornate iron key. "Enjoy your new home," she said, "and do be careful. The woods around here can be a bit disorienting, especially after dark." Her gaze flickered to Sarah again, and this time, Sarah felt a definite chill. It was a look that seemed to hold a warning, or perhaps a judgment. The first few days were idyllic. Mark thrived in his study. Sarah set up her design station. They explored the grounds, finding a path to the lake. The isolation, initially unnerving, began to feel like a cocoon. But then the whispers started. At first, Sarah thought it was just the wind, a soft, indistinct murmur. But it was always there when she was alone, just at the edge of hearing. She'd pause, strain her ears, and it would vanish. "You hear that?" she'd ask Mark in bed. He'd look up, confused. "Hear what, babe?" "Just the crickets." She'd shake her head. "Nothing. Must be my imagination." Then came the footsteps. Light, hesitant steps, always from upstairs or the hallway. Too soft for Mark's, too rhythmic for the house settling. Sarah would lie awake, heart pounding, feeling a cold breath on her neck. One night, she woke to the distinct sound of a child crying, a soft, mournful wail. She nudged Mark. "Did you hear that?" He sat up, groggy. "Hear what? You having a nightmare?" "No." "A baby, crying." They listened. Only crickets. Mark sighed, pulling her closer. "Just a dream, love. Go back to sleep." But Sarah felt his skepticism. It wasn't a dream. The next morning, Sarah saw a small, muddy footprint on the living room floor. Too small for an adult, too distinct to be a smudge and fresh. Her blood ran cold. "Mark!" she called, voice trembling. He came in. What's wrong? He stopped short, seeing the print. Ha! A kid's shoe print. But how? Brenda said the house was empty for years, Sarah countered, voice tight. And it's inside. He shrugged, trying to be nonchalant. Probably just some dust. Or a squirrel. But his eyes betrayed his unease. The incident unsettled Sarah deeply. She started to feel watched. The shadows seemed to deepen, and the old house began to feel like a cage. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were voices, faint and distorted, like a chorus of sorrowful sighs. Sometimes she'd hear her name, or Mark's, whispered from an empty room. The words were fragmented, but carried immense despair. Mine, lost, taken. One afternoon, while Mark was writing, Sarah was sketching. The air suddenly grew heavy, oppressive. The scent of old blood returned, stronger, making her stomach churn. She looked up. Standing in the doorway to the dining room, shrouded in shadow, was a tall, gaunt figure. Its features were indistinct, but she saw the outline of a long, flowing dress and an old-fashioned bonnet. It seemed to shimmer. Sarah froze, heart leaping. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, just stood there, a silent, menacing presence. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of decay and a profound chill. Sarah scrambled up, knocking over her chair. She ran to Mark's study, bursting through the door, gasping. Mark! Mark! I saw something. A ghost. I swear it. He looked up, startled, pale. What? What happened? Sarah, you're white as a sheet. She tried to explain, words tumbling out, breathless, punctuated by sobs. A woman. In the dining room. A ghost? Mark. And the smell of blood. He held her, trying to calm her. Shoot. It's okay, babe. You're just stressed. Maybe you just saw a trick of the light. He tried to rationalize it, but Sarah saw the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe her. That, almost as much as the apparition, terrified her. The incidents escalated. Objects moved. Doors creaked open and shut, sometimes slamming. The temperature in rooms plummeted. Sarah grew withdrawn, plagued by nightmares. Her appetite vanished. Mark seemed oblivious or determined to ignore it. He was thriving in the quiet. He attributed Sarah's distress to stress, subtly suggesting her imagination was working against her. His well-meaning attempts only made Sarah feel more alone. Maybe we should go back to the city for a bit, Sarah pleaded one morning, eyes red-rimmed. Just a weekend. I can't stay here, Mark. Something is wrong. Mark sighed, a hint of impatience. Sarah, we just got here. My work is really taking off. This is what we wanted, remember? Peace and quiet. We can't just abandon everything. He didn't understand. His inability to grasp her terror felt like a chasm opening. The racial dynamic, subtle at first, began to surface. Sarah wondered if Mark's dismissal was partly because she was a black woman, often stereotyped as emotional. Would he believe her more readily if she were white? The thought was a bitter pill, adding isolation. One evening, as they ate dinner, the lights flickered violently. A cold gust of wind swept through the room. A chilling whisper, clear and distinct, echoed from the hallway. Get out. Leave. He is mine. Mark dropped his fork. His eyes, wide with fear, finally met Sarah's. Did you hear that? Sarah nodded, tears streaming, a mixture of relief and renewed terror. Yes, Mark. Finally. Do you believe me now? His face was ashen. We need to call Brenda, or someone. They tried, but the phone lines were dead. The internet was down. They were truly isolated. Panic set in. They decided to leave immediately. They grabbed their bags, hearts pounding. As they rushed downstairs, a loud crash came from the living room. They looked in. The four-poster bed from the master bedroom, impossibly, stood in the middle of the living room, overturned, splintered. A guttural growl filled the air, vibrating through the floorboards. The temperature plummeted further, and the metallic, sweet smell became overpowering. What the hell is going on? Mark yelled, voice cracking. From the deepest shadows, a figure coalesced. It was the woman again, clearer, more terrifying, shimmering. Her face was gaunt, skeletal. Her eyes hollow pits of despair and burning fury. Her dress was an old, blood-stained wedding gown. In her arms, she cradled a small, tattered, blood-soaked blanket. A baby, a tiny, silent bundle. The child crying. The small footprint. It all clicked. The woman raised a skeletal hand, pointing directly at Sarah. Her voice, a rasping whisper, filled the room. She took him. She took my baby. They took him because he was different. Her gaze was fixed on Sarah, a raw, burning hatred. It wasn't just a ghost. It was a ghost consumed by specific, racialized grief and rage. Sarah understood. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was a house haunted by racial injustice, of a child taken because of his mixed heritage. Seeing Sarah, a black woman with a white partner, had ignited her ancient pain. Mark, seeing the ghost's fury, instinctively stepped in front of Sarah. Leave her alone. We don't know what you're talking about. The ghost let out a piercing shriek. The house began to shake violently. Pictures flew, glass shattered, furniture crashed, dust rained down. They took him because he was like her. The ghost wailed, voice growing stronger, more enraged. My beautiful boy, my innocent child. They wouldn't let me keep him. They said he was an abomination, a stain on their name. They took him to save their pure bloodline. Sarah's mind raced, piecing together the history. The Miller family, the South, racial prejudice. This white woman had a child with a black man, a forbidden union. The child was violently taken, perhaps killed, to preserve family honor. Seeing Sarah, a modern echo of her tragic love, ignited her rage. She wasn't just haunting the house. She was haunting the injustice, projecting her trauma onto Sarah. We have to go, Mark. Now. She's going to kill us. Sarah screamed, pulling him towards the door. They turned and ran, scrambling for the front door. The ghost lunged, a cold, spectral hand reaching for Sarah's ankle. Mark shoved her forward, breaking the ghost's grasp, and they burst out into the night. The storm had broken. Rain lashed down, turning the dirt road into a muddy river. Thunder cracked, and lightning illuminated the terrifying silhouette of the house, its dark windows like malevolent eyes. The pines shrieked. They stumbled to their car, fumbling with the keys. Mark jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared. He slammed the car into reverse, tires spitting mud, and sped down the driveway. As they drove away, Sarah looked back. In the upstairs window, illuminated by lightning, stood the ghostly woman, holding her baby, her face a mask of eternal sorrow and rage. Beside her, a shadowy, indistinct man seemed to stand guard. Their faces were etched with torment. They didn't stop driving until they reached the nearest town. They found a motel. Inside, they collapsed, trembling, soaked, adrenaline drained. I can't believe that just happened, Mark whispered, voice hoarse. He looked at Sarah, eyes filled with terror and profound apology.
I am so sorry, Sarah.
I should have listened to you. Sarah reached for his hand. It's okay, Mark. We're safe now. But she knew it wasn't entirely okay. The experience had shaken them, exposing a raw nerve, a painful truth about the world, and how prejudice could manifest, even in the supernatural. They never went back to the Whispering Pines. They forfeited their deposit. The house, they learned from locals, had a dark history. A young Miller woman, early 1900s, fell in love with a black farmhand. They had a child, but the family, horrified, took the baby, giving him to an orphanage, and locked the woman in the house, where she died of grief. The farmhand disappeared. The house wasn't just haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by systemic racism, a pain so profound it transcended death. The ghost hadn't just seen two people. She had seen a painful echo of her own stolen love, her lost child, and her rage was directed at Sarah, who represented the Forbidden Union. Sarah and Mark returned to the city. They found a new appreciation for the noise, the crowds, the anonymity. The experience had changed them. Mark was more attuned to Sarah's instincts, more aware of subtle prejudice. Sarah, though haunted, felt renewed strength, a deeper understanding of historical weight. Their love, tested by fear and the past, emerged stronger, more resilient. They understood their bond was not just personal, but a quiet act of defiance against a world that had once, and sometimes still did, try to keep people like them apart. They carried the memory of the Whispering Pines, a chilling reminder, but also a powerful testament to love overcoming shadows. Their love was a beacon, a refusal to let history dictate their future. And that, in itself, was a victory. The wind, a mournful lament, snaked through the skeletal branches of the whispering woods, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and unsettling, like the breath of a forgotten tomb. Sir Calin, his armor a dull gleam beneath the perpetually overcast sky, tightened his grip on his sword hilt, the cold steel a small comfort against the creeping unease. Beside him, Sir Gareth, younger and less scarred by the world, shivered despite the thick wool beneath his mail and the arduous pace. His breath plumed in the chill air, a fleeting ghost against the oppressive gloom. "This place, it breathes," Gareth murmured, his voice barely a whisper against the wind's sigh, which seemed to carry faint, unintelligible murmurs from the depths of the forest. "It feels alive, in a way no forest should." Calin grunted, his gaze sweeping the gnarled, twisted trees that pressed in on all sides, their branches interweaving into a dense, oppressive canopy that allowed only slivers of bruised light to penetrate. "Aye, and what it breathes is ill. Keep your eyes sharp, lad." The report spoke of disappearances, not just bandits. Farmers, hunters, even a patrol of the king's own men. They vanished without a trace, as if the very earth swallowed them whole. They were on a holy quest, or so the High Council had decreed, their mandate delivered with solemn faces and hushed tones. Children, mostly, vanishing from villages bordering the woods, leaving no trace but a chilling silence, a void where laughter and innocent cries once echoed. The local folk, their faces etched with fear and superstition, spoke of old gods stirring from slumber beneath the earth, of shadows that walked on two legs and whispered promises of eternal slumber, of trees that wept and bled. Calin, a veteran of countless skirmishes against human foes, a man who had faced down charging cavalry and roaring beasts without flinching, felt a prickle of unease that no battle had ever inspired. This was different. This was unnatural. It was a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in his bones, colder than the damp air. They had been tracking for 3 days, pushing deeper into the heart of the whispering woods, following faint, almost imperceptible signs that only Calin's seasoned eye could discern. Broken twigs that lay in unnatural patterns, a disturbed patch of moss where no animal should have trod, the lingering scent of something sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit mixed with grave dirt and something metallic, like old blood. The woods grew denser with each league, the light fading to a perpetual twilight, even at midday. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching, grasping, their ancient roots snaking across the forest floor like slumbering serpents. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen presences, and the only sounds were the ceaseless sigh of the wind and the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the decaying leaves. On the 4th day, the silence deepened, becoming an almost tangible thing. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustle of small creatures, the distant calls of larger beasts had faded entirely. It was as if the woods themselves held their breath, waiting. And then they found her. She sat by the base of an enormous ancient oak, its bark a mosaic of deep furrows and strange, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in their peripheral vision, as if drawn by an unseen hand. The girl was small, no older than 7, her dress torn and muddied, her bare feet caked with grime and clinging leaves. Her hair, a tangled mess of flaxen strands, obscured much of her face, but even from a distance, Kaelin could sense something profoundly wrong. She was humming a tuneless, repetitive melody, a sound that was both childlike and profoundly disturbing, a simple, looping refrain that seemed to resonate with the very silence of the woods. Little one, Kaelin's voice was gentle, a stark contrast to the clang of his armor and the grim set of his jaw. He approached cautiously, his hand still on his sword, his instincts screaming at him to be wary. She looked up. Her eyes were wide, unnaturally bright, and utterly devoid of fear. They were the color of polished obsidian, reflecting the dim light of the woods with an unsettling intensity, like two dark, bottomless pools. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You came," she said, her voice soft, like rustling leaves in a forgotten breeze. Yet it carried an echo that seemed to fill the vast space of the woods, reverberating in their very bones. "I knew you would," Gareth gasped, his hand flying to his mouth, a mixture of relief and dawning horror on his face. "By the saints, she's alive! A miracle!" He started to rush forward, but Kaelin's hand shot out, stopping him. "Are you hurt, child?" Kaelin knelt, trying to meet her gaze, but her obsidian eyes seemed to look through him, beyond him, as if seeing something he could not. There was no sign of injury on her, no tears, no fear, only that unnerving calm. She shook her head slowly, her flaxen hair swaying.
No.
"I'm waiting. Waiting for what, little one?" Gareth asked, stepping closer, his initial relief warring fiercely with a nascent unease that was rapidly growing into full-blown dread. The girl's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed a shade too sharp, too numerous for a child, like tiny, pearlescent needles. For them, they like new friends, especially ones who carry shiny things. Her gaze flickered to Kaelin's sword, then to Gareth's, a hungry, ancient light in her dark eyes. As if on cue, a sudden, piercing shriek tore through the air, not from the girl, but from deep within the woods. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that made the hair stand up on Kaelin's arms, a sound that spoke of flesh tearing and bones snapping. It was followed by a wet, sickening thud. "What was that?" Gareth demanded, his face paling, his hand instinctively gripping his sword hilt. The girl giggled, a sound that grated on Kaelin's nerves, a sound devoid of innocence, filled instead with a chilling amusement. "They're playing. They always play before they eat." Before Kaelin could react, before he could even process the full implication of her words, the ground beneath them began to heave. It wasn't a tremor, but a deliberate, organic movement. Roots, thick as a man's thigh, erupted from the earth, coiling and twisting like monstrous serpents, tearing through the damp soil with a sound like tearing cloth. The enormous, ancient oak behind the girl seemed to groan, its massive bark rippling as if alive, and the strange, swirling patterns on its trunk began to glow with a faint, sickly green light, pulsing in time with the girl's incessant humming. "Get back, Gareth!" Kaelin roared, drawing his sword with a practiced, deadly hiss of steel. He knew with a sudden, terrible certainty that they had walked into a trap. Gareth stumbled backward, tripping over a newly risen root, his armor clanking loudly. He scrambled to his feet, his own sword drawn, his eyes wide with terror, fixed on the shifting shadows between the trees. From those shadows, from the very fabric of the woods, they emerged. Not beasts, not men, but something in between, something that defied easy categorization. Figures tall and gaunt, their limbs unnaturally long and spindly, like twisted branches, their skin like stretched, ancient bark, mottled with moss and fungi. Their heads were smooth, featureless, save for two glowing green orbs where eyes should be, burning with an internal cold fire, and a wide, lipless maw that seemed to pulsate with an inner light, revealing no teeth, only a dark, endless void. They moved with a disturbing fluidity, silent as shadows, yet radiating an aura of immense, ancient power, a primordial malevolence that made the air crackle. "The treefolk of legend," Gareth whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible. "But they're real. and they're not friendly. The girl, still sitting calmly by the base of the oak, clapped her hands, a slow, deliberate sound that echoed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Her unsettling smile was fixed on the approaching horrors, a look of profound satisfaction on her face. "See? I told you they'd come. They love visitors." Kalen knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that these were not creatures to be fought with steel alone. They were something else, something from a forgotten age, guardians of this cursed wood, or perhaps its very manifestation. But he was a knight, sworn to protect the innocent, sworn to face down evil, no matter its form. He would not yield. "Protect the child," Kalen shouted, his voice ringing with a false bravado, though a part of him, a small, terrified voice, wondered if the child was the one who needed protecting, or if she was the bait, the spider at the center of this monstrous web. The tree folk moved with terrifying speed, a silent, deadly ballet of bark and glowing eyes. One, taller and more sinuous than the others, lunged at Gareth, its long skeletal arm extending, its hand ending in razor-sharp talons that resembled sharpened roots, capable of tearing flesh and bone. Gareth parried, his sword clanging against the creature's woody flesh, a sound like stone striking stone. But the impact sent a jarring shockwave up his arm, numbing his fingers. The creature merely recoiled slightly, its glowing eyes unwavering. Kalen engaged another, its glowing eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. He swung his sword in a wide arc, aiming for its featureless head, but the creature swayed, its body blurring, its form seeming to dissolve into the shadows for a fraction of a second, and his blade passed through empty air. It was like fighting a phantom, a nightmare made flesh, solid one moment, intangible the next. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and decay, a sickly sweet aroma that made his stomach churn. The green light from the oak intensified, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch like living things, distorting reality. The girl's humming grew louder, more insistent, weaving itself into the very fabric of the woods, a hypnotic, maddening drone that burrowed into Kalen's mind, threatening to shatter his sanity. One of the tree folk, faster and more cunning than the others, darted past Kalen, its movements a blur, heading straight for the girl. Kalen roared, turning to intercept, but he was too slow, his armor weighing him down. The creature reached her, its taloned hand extended, but instead of seizing her, it gently touched her cheek, its rough, bark-like fingers surprisingly delicate. The girl leaned into the touch, her eyes closing, her smile serene, a picture of disturbing contentment. The tree folk then turned its glowing gaze back to the knights, and a low, guttural growl, like the grinding of ancient stones, or the roots of the earth shifting, emanated from its maw, a sound of immense, terrible satisfaction. "She's one of them," Gareth gasped, his face a mask of dawning horror, his voice cracking with the realization. "She's not a victim, she's a lure. They sent her." The realization struck Kalen with the force of a physical blow, a cold, crushing weight in his chest. All the missing children, the whispers, the unnatural silence. They weren't taken, they were transformed. Or perhaps, they were born of this place, ancient seeds sprouting into human form, sent out to draw new souls into the maw of the woods, to replenish the forest's macabre harvest. The tree folk pressed their attack, their movements becoming more aggressive, more coordinated, a silent, deadly dance of hunters and prey. Kalen fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, his blade a blur, a desperate flash of defiance against the overwhelming tide. But for every one he managed to strike, another seemed to materialize from the shadows, or the one he struck would simply reform, its woody flesh knitting back together with an unsettling speed. The acidic scent in the air grew stronger, burning his nostrils, making his eyes water. He could feel it stinging his exposed skin, a faint, burning itch. Gareth, overwhelmed by the sheer number and unnatural speed of the creatures, was forced back against the gnarled trunk of a smaller tree, its bark rough against his mail. A tree folk, its glowing eyes burning into his soul, advanced, its talons poised, its lipless maw opening slightly, emitting a faint, resonant hum. Gareth screamed, a raw, primal sound of terror and agony, as the creature's hand closed around his face, its sharp talons digging into his flesh. He thrashed, his struggles desperate but futile, his movements growing weak, his screams fading into choked gasps. Kalen watched in horror, helpless, as Gareth's body began to contort, his armor groaning and splitting under the unnatural transformation. His skin darkened, taking on a rough, bark-like texture, his limbs elongated, stretching and twisting into grotesque, branch-like forms. His screams turned into a wet, gurgling croak, then a series of low, guttural hums that mirrored the girl's melody. The green light from the oak pulsed brighter, and Gareth's eyes, once filled with human fear, began to glow with the same unsettling green as the treefolk, reflecting the ancient malevolence of the woods. He was changing, becoming one of them, his humanity dissolving, replaced by the essence of the forest's horror. Kalen felt a cold dread seep into his very bones, chilling him to the core. He was alone, surrounded by ancient, malevolent entities, and a child who was their silent, terrifying accomplice, a puppet master pulling invisible strings. He knew he could not win this fight. His sword was useless against such a foe, his strength meaningless against their ancient power. He looked at the girl, still sitting calmly, her eyes now open, watching Gareth's transformation with an almost scientific detachment, a quiet fascination. Her smile was wider now, more knowing, more chilling, a silent promise of what awaited him. "You're next," she whispered, her voice soft, yet carrying over the sounds of the struggle, a promise of inevitable doom, a final, chilling invitation. Kalen, his breath ragged, his body screaming with exhaustion and fear, made a desperate decision. He would not be another victim, another grotesque addition to this cursed forest. He would not become one of them. He would not join Gareth in this living death. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, a final, primal instinct for survival, he turned and ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to escape this place, this living nightmare. He ran blindly, crashing through undergrowth, his armor snagging on thorns, his breath rasping in his throat. The treefolk pursued him, their silent, fluid movements unnervingly fast, their glowing eyes burning holes in the darkness behind him. He could hear the rustle of their bark-like skin, the faint, high-pitched hum of their inner light drawing closer, closer. He burst through a thicket of thorns, tearing his armor, scratching his skin, leaving trails of blood on the sharp branches, but he didn't feel the pain. His mind was consumed by one thought: escape, escape or die. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs ached with exhaustion, until every muscle screamed in protest. The trees began to thin, the oppressive canopy giving way to patches of less dense forest, the light growing brighter, a faint, hopeful glimmer in the distance. He stumbled out of the woods, collapsing onto the damp earth of a familiar path, gasping for breath, his body trembling violently. He lay there for a long time, listening, his heart pounding against his ribs. The wind still whispered, but it was a different whisper now, a less malevolent one, the sounds of a normal forest slowly returning. The unsettling silence of the woods was replaced by the distant chirping of crickets, the rustle of normal leaves, the hoot of an owl. He was out. He had escaped. He had survived. But as he pushed himself up, his body aching, his mind reeling from the horrors he had witnessed, he felt a strange sensation on his skin, a tingling, a faint itch, like something crawling beneath the surface. He looked down at his hands, caked with mud and blood. His skin, where the thorns had scratched him, was not bleeding freely. Instead, a faint, sickly green tint was beginning to spread from the cuts, like a bruise, slowly darkening, growing rougher. And his fingers, they seemed a fraction longer, a fraction more slender than he remembered, the nails hardening, thickening. He stared at his reflection in a shallow puddle, his heart seizing in his chest, a new, terrible dread eclipsing the old. His eyes, though still human, held a faint, unsettling glimmer of gold, a reflection of the ancient light he had seen in the depths of the woods. The girl's voice, soft and echoing, seemed to whisper in his mind, a chilling lullaby. You came, they like new friends, and now, you are one of us. He had escaped the woods, but the woods had not finished with him. The horror had followed him, seeped into his very being, a slow, insidious poison. He was not free. He was merely transforming. And soon, when the change was complete, he would find himself drawn back to the whispering woods, not as a knight, but as something else, something new, something that hummed a tuneless, repetitive melody and waited patiently for new friends. The horror had just begun, and Kalen, the valiant knight, was now its unwitting harbinger. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, a relentless, drumming curtain that blurred the lines between sky and swamp. Private Miller, his uniform a sodden second skin, cursed under his breath as another cold drop found its way down his collar. His boots squelched with every step, each movement a struggle against the sucking mud that threatened to swallow them whole. Around him, the other members of Bravo Company moved like specters, their faces grim, their rifles clutched tight. "Any sign, Sergeant?" Miller rasped, his voice hoarse from the damp and the constant strain. Sergeant Thorne, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of 100 campaigns, merely shook his head. "Nothing but the damn frogs, Miller. And the silence. The silence. That was the real horror. Not the silence of a battlefield after the guns had fallen quiet, but a deeper, more profound quiet. The swamp should have been alive with the chirps of insects, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant cries of birds. But here, in this particular stretch of the Blackwater Mire, there was only the ceaseless patter of rain and the chorus of the frogs. They were everywhere. Not the small, harmless tree frogs or the plump, croaking bullfrogs of home. These were different. Larger, for one, some the size of a man's fist, others almost as big as his head. Their skin was a mottled, sickly green, slick with mucus, and their eyes were the worst. Luminous, golden orbs that seemed to glow in the perpetual twilight of the swamp. Unblinking, unervingly intelligent. They watched. From lily pads, from the gnarled roots of cypress trees, from beneath fallen logs. Always watching. The first incident had been a week ago. Private Jenkins, a nervous kid fresh out of basic, had gone to relieve himself behind a thicket of reeds. They'd heard his scream, a choked, gurgling sound that had sent a shiver down every man's spine. When they found him, he was sprawled face down in the shallow water, his eyes wide and staring, his mouth agape, and clinging to his face, a dozen of the large, green frogs, their bodies twitching, their long, sticky tongues flicking in and out of his open mouth. Thorne had shot them off, one by one, their bodies exploding in a spray of green ichor and bone. But the image of Jenkins's vacant stare, and the way the frogs had seemed to be feeding, had haunted their nightmares ever since. They tried to report it, but command had dismissed it as swamp fever, a hallucination brought on by the oppressive humidity and the psychological stress of the mission. "Keep moving, Bravo," the crackle on the radio had said. "Locate the objective."
No deviations.
The objective, a downed reconnaissance drone, deep within enemy territory. A simple retrieval mission, they'd been told. But the swamp had other plans. As they pushed deeper, the air grew thicker, heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and acrid. The frog chorus intensified, a throbbing, guttural hum that vibrated in their bones, a sound that felt less like an animal call and more like a ritualistic chant. Specialist Davies, a quiet, stoic man who rarely showed fear, suddenly stumbled. He let out a choked cry, clutching his leg. "Something bit me. God, it burns." Miller dropped to his knees, shining his tactical light on Davies's shin. A large, dark red welt was rapidly swelling, and a single, particularly enormous frog, its skin almost black, was hopping away into the murky water. "It's just a bite, Davies," Thorn said, trying to sound reassuring, but his voice lacked conviction. "We'll get you patched up." But Davies was already convulsing, his eyes rolling back in his head. Foam frothed at his lips. His skin began to take on a greenish tint, his veins bulging like thick cords beneath the surface. His fingers clawed at the mud, his body writhing in an unnatural dance. He's changing," Miller whispered, horrified. It was true. Davies' skin was growing slicker, his features distorting. His eyes, once human, were widening, turning a sickly yellow. A low, wet croak escaped his throat. Not his own voice, but something alien. Thorn, his face pale, raised his rifle. "I'm sorry, son." The shot echoed through the swamp, a stark punctuation mark to the amphibian chorus. Davies went still, a grotesque parody of a man, half human, half frog. The frogs around them, however, did not scatter. Instead, their calls grew louder, more insistent, as if in triumph. They buried Davies quickly, shallowly, the mud refusing to yield. The rain continued, washing away the evidence, but not the terror. Days bled into nights. The drone remained elusive, their rations dwindled, and the frogs were always there. They no longer merely watched. They seemed to anticipate their movements, appearing suddenly on their path, blocking their way, their golden eyes fixed on them with an unnerving intensity. Private Rodriguez, a devout man who carried a worn Bible in his pack, began to talk to himself, muttering prayers, then curses. He swore the frogs were whispering to him, promising him release, promising him a new form. One morning, Miller awoke to find Rodriguez gone. His rifle lay discarded in the mud, and a trail of large, webbed footprints led away from their makeshift camp, deeper into the swamp. They followed, their hearts pounding. The footprints led them to a clearing, where the trees grew unnaturally twisted, their branches draped with thick, phosphorescent moss. In the center of the clearing was a pool of black, stagnant water, shimmering with an unholy light. And there, at the edge of the pool, was Rodriguez. But it wasn't Rodriguez. His body was bloated, his limbs elongated, his skin a mottled green. His mouth was a wide, lipless slit, and his eyes, once filled with human fear, now glowed with the same unsettling golden light as the other frogs. He was surrounded by dozens of them, all croaking, all watching. He turned his head, a slow, unnatural movement, and fixed his new amphibian gaze upon them. A low, wet chuckle, devoid of humanity, emanated from his throat. Thorn didn't hesitate this time. He opened fire, a burst from his automatic rifle tearing through the grotesque form that had once been their comrade. The frogs scattered, a green wave receding into the shadows. "We have to get out of here," Miller choked, his stomach churning. "This place is cursed." "We can't," Thorn said, his voice grim. "Orders. The drone. The drone." It had become a phantom, a reason to stay in this living nightmare. They found it eventually, nestled in a clearing choked with strange, bulbous fungi. It was intact, miraculously, its metallic shell gleaming dully in the perpetual gloom. But as they approached, the ground around it began to ripple. The fungi pulsed with a faint, internal light. And then they emerged, not just the frogs, but something else. Larger, much larger. From beneath the earth, from the depths of the black water, they rose. Colossal amphibians, their bodies the size of small tanks, their skin a patchwork of scales and slick mucus, their eyes, enormous and golden, fixed on the soldiers with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. Their mouths, vast and gaping, revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. These were not mere animals. These were the masters of the mire, the architects of the horror. One of them, a monstrous creature with a crown of jagged bone protruding from its head, let out a deafening croak that shook the very ground. The smaller frogs, thousands upon thousands of them, surged forward, a living tide of green and gold. "Open fire," Thorn roared, his voice barely audible above the rising din. They unleashed a volley of bullets, but the creatures were too numerous, too resilient. The rounds seemed to glance off their thick hides, or simply embed themselves without effect. The smaller frogs, however, were a different matter. They swarmed, leaping onto the soldiers, their sticky tongues lashing out, their sharp claws tearing at flesh. Miller felt one land on his face, its cold, wet body pressing against his cheek. He screamed, tearing it off, its tiny, sharp teeth leaving angry red welts. Another latched onto his arm, its grip surprisingly strong. He could feel its tongue, rough and abrasive, exploring his skin. He saw Private Chong, a quiet, studious man, overwhelmed by a dozen of the smaller frogs. They covered him, a living shroud, their bodies twitching, their tongues working. He thrashed, his screams muffled, then ceased. When the frogs finally dispersed, Chong was gone, his uniform lying in a crumpled heap, empty. "They're dissolving them," Thorn yelled, his face contorted in a mask of horror. "Their skin, it's acidic." The realization hit Miller like a physical blow. The mucus, the tongues, the rapid decomposition of Jenkins and Chong. These frogs weren't just biting. They were consuming, dissolving their victims, absorbing them into their grotesque forms. The colossal amphibians advanced, their massive bodies crushing the fungi, sending tremors through the ground. Their croaks were no longer just calls. They were a symphony of hunger, a promise of oblivion. Thorn, his face grim, emptied his magazine into the largest of the creatures, but it merely blinked its golden eyes, unfazed. He turned to Miller, his expression one of grim resignation. "This is it, son. Make it count." Miller, his hands shaking, raised his rifle. He fired, but his shots were futile. The swamp was closing in, the green tide of frogs washing over them. He felt a sharp, burning sensation on his leg, then his arm. The acidic mucus was already at work, dissolving his uniform, stinging his skin. He saw Thorn, surrounded, fighting valiantly, but ultimately overwhelmed. The last thing Miller saw before the world dissolved into a blinding green haze was Thorn's face, contorted in a final, defiant scream, as the monstrous amphibians closed in, their vast mouths opening, ready to consume. The rain continued to fall, washing over the Blackwater mire, cleansing it of the last vestiges of humanity. The drone lay undisturbed, a silent monument to a mission that had gone horribly wrong. And the frogs, the masters of the swamp, resumed their ancient, guttural chorus, a lullaby of consumption, a song of the mire. The golden eyes watched, unblinking, waiting for the next intrusion, the next meal. The swamp had claimed its own, and it would continue to do so forever. The forest was a living, breathing entity, ancient and unforgiving. Its gnarled trees, draped in moss like skeletal fingers, clawed at a sky perpetually shrouded in mist. Elias Thorn, a man whose life had been etched by the harsh realities of the wilderness, moved through it with the silent grace of a predator. His rifle, a well-oiled extension of his arm, was always ready. Elias was a hunter, not by sport, but by necessity, providing for his small, isolated village nestled deep in the forgotten valleys of the Appalachians. For years, the forest had yielded its bounty: deer, bear, elk. But recently, a new presence had settled in, subtle at first, then increasingly undeniable. It began with whispers among the villagers, tales of strange lights in the woods, of animals found dead with no discernible wounds, their eyes wide with an unearthly terror. Elias, a man of logic and steel, dismissed them as old wives' tales, the ramblings of fear-mongering folk, until he saw it. It was a fox. Not just any fox, but one of impossible beauty, its fur the color of burnished copper, its eyes like chips of emerald. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, a shimmering blur through the undergrowth. He had seen it only for a fleeting moment, a flash of impossible speed, but it had left an indelible mark on his mind. And after that sighting, the whispers in the village grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of a kitsune, a fox spirit, ancient and powerful, that had come to their valley. Elias, though skeptical of spirits, knew something was wrong. The game had vanished, driven away by an unseen terror. His traps lay empty, his snares untouched. Hunger, a familiar enemy, began to gnaw at the village. He decided then that the fox, spirit or not, was the cause. He would hunt it. His first attempts were futile. The fox was a phantom, always a step ahead, always vanishing just as he raised his rifle. He spent weeks tracking it, pushing deeper into the forest than he had ever dared. The trees grew thicker, the shadows deeper, the silence more profound. The air itself seemed to hum with an unseen energy, and sometimes he swore he heard faint, mocking laughter carried on the wind. One frigid afternoon, he finally cornered it. It was in a clearing, bathed in a sliver of weak sunlight that pierced the canopy. The fox stood there, not fleeing, but watching him, its emerald eyes glinting with an unsettling intelligence. It had not one tail, but three, each one swishing with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Elias raised his rifle, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He aimed, his finger tightening on the trigger. The fox merely tilted its head, a silent, knowing challenge in its gaze. He fired. The shot echoed through the ancient woods, a defiant roar against the oppressive silence. The fox didn't fall. Instead, a shimmering, almost translucent barrier seemed to ripple around it, deflecting the bullet with a faint, musical chime. The projectile ricocheted off a tree, burying itself harmlessly in the earth. Elias stared, his mind reeling. This was no ordinary fox. This was the kitsune of the legends. The fox let out a low, chittering laugh, a sound that was both playful and deeply unsettling. Then it spoke, not with a voice, but directly into his mind. A cold, clear thought that resonated in his skull. "You cannot harm me, hunter. I am ancient. I am eternal." Elias stumbled back, dropping his rifle. His blood ran cold. He had faced bears, wolves, and desperate men, but never something that could speak in his head, something that defied the laws of nature. The fox took a step towards him, its three tails fanning out, casting strange, shifting shadows. "You are an interesting one, Elias Thorne. You possess a stubborn will, a spirit unbent by fear, a rare quality in these fading lands. What do you want?" Elias stammered, his voice hoarse. "I want to play," the thought echoed, and a chilling smile seemed to spread across the fox's muzzle, though its features remained unchanged. "And you, hunter, are my new toy." A wave of profound dread washed over Elias. He scrambled for his rifle, but the fox was too fast. It darted around him, a coppery blur, and suddenly he felt a sharp, burning pain in his leg. He looked down. A deep, jagged cut, as if made by a razor-sharp claw, bled freely through his trousers. The fox stood a few paces away, its eyes gleaming. "A small taste, to show you what awaits if you continue to defy me." Elias, despite the pain and terror, felt a surge of defiant anger. He wouldn't be a toy. He wouldn't let this creature terrorize his village. He grabbed his rifle, ignoring the throbbing in his leg, and aimed again. The fox vanished, reappearing instantly behind him. He felt a cold breath on his neck and another searing pain, this time on his arm. He spun around, firing wildly, but the fox was gone again, its mocking laughter echoing in his mind. This was no hunt. This was a torment. Days turned into weeks. Elias, wounded and exhausted, stumbled back to his village, a shadow of his former self. The villagers recoiled from him, their fear of the kitsune now extended to him, the man who had dared to challenge it. His wounds, though not deep, refused to heal, festering with an unnatural slowness. And the whispers, the fox's whispers, never left him. They were constant, insidious, telling him of his failures, of the village's impending doom, of the futility of his struggle. The kitsune began to appear in the village itself, at first as fleeting glimpses, then openly, its three tails swaying, its emerald eyes fixed on the terrified faces of the inhabitants. Animals continued to disappear, crops withered, and a strange, wasting sickness began to afflict the children. Elias knew he had to act. He was the only one who had faced it, the only one who understood the true nature of the threat. He sought out the village elder, old Alara, a woman whose eyes held the wisdom of generations. "It's the kitsune, isn't it, Alara?" Elias rasped, his voice raw from disuse. Alara, her face a roadmap of ancient sorrows, nodded slowly. "It is. It feeds on fear, Elias, on despair. It thrives on the slow decay of hope. How do we stop it?" "You cannot kill what is immortal," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But you can banish it, or you can bind it." She spoke of ancient rituals, of forgotten lore, of a time when man and spirit walked a finer line. The kitsune, she explained, drew its power from belief, from the very fear it instilled. To banish it, they needed to starve it of that fear. To bind it, they needed a sacrifice not of blood, but of essence. A strong will, a pure heart, offered willingly. Elias listened, his mind a whirlwind of despair and a flicker of desperate hope. He knew what he had to do. He would bind it. He would offer himself. That night, under a moon that seemed to bleed silver, Elias returned to the clearing where he had first faced the kitsune. He carried no rifle, only a small, intricately carved wooden box, given to him by Alara. He felt no fear, only a grim resolve. The whispers in his mind were a clamor, but he pushed them back, focusing on the task ahead. The fox appeared, materializing from the shadows, its three tails twitching with anticipation. "You return, hunter. Have you come to accept your fate? To become another shadow in my collection?" "I have come to end this," Elias said, his voice steady, devoid of fear. The kitsune laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "Foolish mortal, you cannot fight the inevitable." "Perhaps not," Elias replied, opening the wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried herbs, was a single polished stone, smooth and black as obsidian. "But I can change it." He held out the stone. "This is my will, my defiance, my hope for my people. Take it, and leave us be." The kitsune paused, its emerald eyes fixed on the stone. A flicker of something akin to curiosity, then confusion crossed its features. It had expected fear, despair, a broken spirit. "Not this. What is this trick?" It whispered in his mind, a hint of unease in its tone. "No trick," Elias said, his voice gaining strength. "A choice. Take my essence, my will, and be bound. Or face a spirit that will never break, and forever be denied the feast you crave." The kitsune circled him, its tails lashing, its whispers a furious torrent of threats and promises. It tried to break his resolve, to fill his mind with terror, but Elias stood firm, his gaze unwavering, his hand holding out the stone. He had faced death too many times to fear it now. He was offering something far more precious than his life. Finally, with a frustrated hiss, the kitsune lunged, not at Elias, but at the stone. Its shadowy form seemed to flow into the obsidian, which pulsed with a brief, blinding green light. The three tails thrashed, then slowly, agonizingly, began to shrink, retracting into the fox's body. The shimmering aura around it faded. The fox let out a piercing shriek, a sound of pure agony and rage, as its form began to solidify. Its fur lost its unnatural sheen, its eyes dimmed, becoming merely the eyes of a wild animal. It was still a fox, but no longer a spirit. Its power, its immortality, its connection to the ancient, whispering darkness, was gone, absorbed into the obsidian stone. The stone in Elias's hand grew heavy, pulsating with a faint, internal warmth. He looked at the fox. It was smaller now, its movements jerky, confused. It was just a fox, a wounded, ordinary fox. It whimpered, then turned and limped away into the darkness, its three tails replaced by a single, scraggly one. Elias collapsed, the strength draining from him. He clutched the stone to his chest. He had done it. He had bound the kitsune. But the cost, the whispers in his mind were gone, replaced by a profound silence. But he felt something else now, a faint, alien presence, a cold, vast emptiness that had taken root within him. He had absorbed the kitsune's essence, its ancient hunger, its cosmic despair. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, the hunter. He was something more, something touched by the eternal. He returned to the village, the obsidian stone clutched tightly in his hand. The sickness began to recede, the animals slowly returned, and the oppressive dread lifted. The villagers hailed him as a hero, but they still looked at him differently, with a new kind of awe and a subtle fear. They saw the deep lines of exhaustion on his face, the haunted look in his eyes, the way he sometimes paused, listening to something only he could hear. Elias lived out his days in the village, a silent guardian. He never hunted again, for the hunger within him was not for flesh. He guarded the obsidian stone, keeping it hidden, knowing that its power and the kitsune's essence now resided within him. He felt the pull of the deep, the ancient knowledge, the vast emptiness. He was immortal in a way, bound to the spirit he had vanquished. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the moon was hidden and the wind howled through the forest, he would feel a faint whisper in his mind, a familiar, chilling thought. The game continues